A bell rang to signal the lunch break at school. Inside one of the classrooms, a student named Hidaka was startled when a bully addressed him with contempt and told him to go buy juice for him. Another student beside the bully immediately added his own order to the request. Hidaka smiled quietly and went along with it without protest. This kind of thing happened every single day. He was treated like a personal errand boy by the people around him, and the reason he never fought back or refused was that he had been cursed with the personality of someone who simply submitted. This was the shape his daily life had taken. A girl student named Kawachi walked over to the group and asked directly whether they were bullying Hidaka again. She pointed out that they were already in high school, and yet they were still acting like playground bullies from their younger years. One of the boys immediately dismissed her concern and said Hidaka was simply going to buy some juice, as though nothing at all was wrong with the situation. The bully threw his arm casually around Hidaka's shoulder and said they were all friends. The boy standing beside the bully backed this up and told Kawachi that she had gotten the wrong impression. Kawachi then turned her attention directly to Hidaka and asked whether that was really how he saw it. Hidaka confirmed it and said nothing wrong had been done. Kawachi asked him quietly whether he was truly all right with the way things were. Hidaka looked at her and responded with a question of his own, asking what she was trying to suggest while pretending not to understand her meaning. He then left the room. As he walked, his thoughts turned to something he had considered for a long time. He knew that in any situation involving bullying, there were 4 types of people who played a role in keeping it going. There were bystanders who watched without acting, supporters who encouraged the bullies from side, the bullies themselves, and the victims. He believed that everyone in such situations had a part they were playing, whether they admitted it or not. But in reality, he observed, most people told themselves they were not involved at all. He made his way up to the rooftop of the school building and stood looking out at the view spread before him. He thought to himself that he was broken, then corrected himself. He was not the one who was broken. It was the world itself that was wrong. Then, without hesitation, he stepped off the rooftop. His final thought as he fell was that he was saying goodbye to everyone. It was not exactly that he had wanted to die. It was more that he no longer wanted to keep living. He thought about his classmates and told himself that it would not matter to them either way. On that day, Hidako Masamune died. A short while later, he opened his eyes. He heard a voice nearby, saying that they had succeeded. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing before what appeared to be a king, surrounded by people who looked like mages. He could not understand what was happening or where he was, and was not even sure whether he was still alive. The king addressed them and welcomed them as heroes. He was startled further when he realized that his entire class appeared to be there with him as well, and could hear his classmates murmuring among themselves about what any of this could possibly mean. The king introduced himself as Johannes Greyberg, the 47th king of the country of Greyberg. Hidaka was deeply confused. He explained that his kingdom had been locked in a long and difficult war against magical entities, and that no end to the fighting was anywhere in sight. Faced with this desperate situation, the kingdom had turned to the ritual of hero summoning as a way to break the deadlock. The king explained that according to written records, those who were summoned as heroes would possess extraordinary abilities and skills far beyond those of ordinary people. One of the students who had been involved in the bullying spoke up in disbelief, saying he did not understand what any of this was about, and that as far as he was concerned, this was kidnapping. An explosion went off right at his feet, startling him badly. The king apologized for the shock and explained that what had just happened was magic. The students reacted with collective surprise and alarm. The king acknowledged that it was genuinely difficult to explain these things to people who had no frame of reference to believe in them, and said that showing them directly was the most effective way. One of the other students addressed the bully whose name was Siki and told him plainly that they were currently surrounded on all sides by armed guards. This was not a situation where picking a fight with the king was going to be possible. The same student pointed out that none of them understood what was happening and said the least they could do was listen to what was being said. A girl student also weighed in and told Siki to stay quiet for the time being. Siki looked between them and agreed to hold back. The king assured them all that they had nothing to fear. He said they had no intention of harming anyone. A summoning ritual of this scale was an enormously difficult undertaking, and it would make no sense at all to kill the very heroes they had worked so hard to bring there. Siki, still struggling to accept the situation, pushed back and pointed out that they were just ordinary students. The king gathered them all and explained that each person had been granted an extraordinary power along with an occupation. Those who received the occupation of hero were considered specially gifted above the rest. A woman then instructed the group that by uttering the word status, they would be able to see their own abilities for themselves. Siki did exactly that, and a status window appeared before him. He was identified as Siki Kenta, a level 1 human of the occupation stage. All of his stats were visible to him, and his title was listed as hero, with his magic technique being the flaming hammer. The woman was immediately stunned by what she saw and rushed to inform the king that Siki was a sage. The king expressed great surprise, as the sage was considered the highest class of knights combined with the attributes of a priest. The woman smiled and told the king that things were even more remarkable than that, because Siki also carried the title of hero, which left the king completely taken aback. The woman then turned her attention to another student, Ichiro Yukimura. He was a level 1 hero with a unique skill called the Hero's Sword Excalibur. His magic techniques included combust, waterfall, thundershock, windblade, and sandstorm, and his unique technique was explosion. A student named Hidako watched all of this unfold and thought about how incredible it all was. He wondered whether the people around him were already living fulfilling lives and would now get to live even greater ones. The thought sparked a hope in him that perhaps he too had received something special. He summoned his own status window and looked immediately at his occupation. He was only a healer, and his title was listed not as hero, but as reincarnated. He stared at his blessings in disbelief and asked the woman what the healer class meant. She told him plainly that healers were a recovery-based occupation and were considered the weakest class of all. Hidako's expression fell with worry. Siki wasted no time in pointing out what the woman had said, mocking Hidaka and questioning why he was even there among them. Another student named Kawachi tried to stop Siki from continuing, but Siki pressed on, brushing it off as though it were simply an honest observation. Ichijo stepped in and told Siki firmly that he had gone too far and was being disrespectful to Hidaka. Before anything more could be said, an old man approached Hidaka and asked him one quiet but pointed question. Why was he the only one whose status listed the word reincarnated? The room fell into shocked silence. Hidaka explained that it was because he had jumped from a rooftop and fallen. The old man said nothing beyond acknowledging that he understood the situation. The woman then called everyone together to continue her explanation. Hidaka stood there, stunned that the subject was simply dropped and moved past so quickly. The woman went on to explain that all of them would be enrolled in a school where they would train exclusively to develop their powers and learn to combat magical entities. To begin this process, they would all be transported to student dormitories. As the group prepared to move, Hidaka stood still and thought about the fact that he had not wanted to live, and so he had stopped living. Siki, walking past, told him that he really was worthless after all. Hidaka replied inwardly that being a healer was still better than being a shut-in with no purpose. Though somewhere in his mind, he felt as though he had somehow ended up in the exact same kind of daily routine he had always known, just in a different place. Before walking away, Siki made one final remark. That was fine, because no one expected anything from a suicidal lowlife anyway. Hidaka thought bitterly to himself that even in a different world, this person's cruelty had followed him here. A feeling rose up in Hidaka, and he asked Siki whether he truly found this entertaining. Siki stopped and turned around sharply. He grabbed Hidaka by the collar and demanded to know what he had just said. Hidaka told him it did not matter, that he was disgusted by him, and declared plainly that he was not going with the group. The woman looked at Hidaka and admitted that from the very moment she had discovered he was a healer, she had already decided he would be transported to a completely different location from everyone else. The students around them were stunned. She went on to explain that the destination would be entirely random with no way of predicting where he would end up. She described it as a security system designed to ensure that their people could always receive aid when needed. Hidaka looked at her and expressed quiet gratitude, but she immediately corrected him, making clear that he had misunderstood entirely. The system was not for his benefit. It existed for their people, to protect their kingdom and its future. She raised her voice and declared that this magical tool had been created to save the lives and futures of their countrymen. It had been used to summon powerful and extraordinary beings, and yet what they had received was this, a healer. She demanded to know how they were supposed to explain that to the people, depending on them for safety and protection. Siki placed a hand on Hidaka's shoulder and told him casually that he really was trash after all. A magical circle began to glow and form beneath Hidaka's feet. The woman's voice rose even further as she declared that he had committed the sin of wasting their hope and effort, and that he would now pay for it with his life. Hidaka looked at all of them, standing around him. Something inside him finally broke open. He thought about why it was always him who ended up in this position. He swore that he would destroy them, every last one of them, and the country they stood in. He would reduce it all to ash so completely that not even dust would remain. In the last moments before the teleportation took hold of him, he told every single person in that room that he would absolutely kill them all. Then he was gone, thrown into a place of complete and total darkness. He walked through the dark for what felt like a very long time, with no idea where he was or how far he had gone. He summoned his status window again and stared at it. He reminded himself what he already knew, that he was the weakest. But then something in the window caught his eye. Listed under his conditions was something at level 1 called Otherworld Obsession Syndrome, a disorder that afflicted those who had spent their lives longing to be in another world. Hidaka looked at it for a moment, and then a small, strange smile crossed his face. Even here, at the very bottom of everything, in the dark and completely alone, he was sick in a way that was entirely his own. Hidaka suddenly came across a treasure box in the darkness. He had lost track of how long he had been wandering, and the only thing he had managed to find along the way was a torch. By the time he became fully aware of his surroundings, he was already standing inside a room filled with chests. He opened the first one, but it turned out to be completely empty. He decided he might as well go ahead and open all of them. When he opened the second chest, he found a small bottle sitting inside it. He stared at the bottle and wondered whether it might be poison, though something about it did not quite give him that feeling. Without any warning, a voice spoke to him from somewhere unknown. The voice told him to drink the contents of the bottle. Hidako was startled and looked around, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. The voice spoke again, pressing him further. It told him that he wanted more and more power, and that if that was the case, he should drink every last drop. Hidaka stood there holding the bottle in his hand, turning the idea over in his mind. He was not sure whether he was simply imagining the voice, but he also could not shake the thought that what it said might actually be true. He'd spent a great deal of time thinking about what he would do if he were ever given another chance at life. His long-held wish had always been to live in a different world, and now that he was standing in one, he wondered if this was truly the second chance he had been given. He unclenched his fist, opened the bottle, and drank it completely, all the way to the very last drop. He reasoned to himself that it might just be worth the risk. In his mind, life had already led him down a path with no good options, and dying in a dark maze was no worse than anything else he had already faced. With nothing to lose, there was no real reason to turn down the gamble the potion was offering him. The scene then shifted to an entirely different place. At the National Academy of Ares Greyberg, inside the Kingdom of Greyberg, the students had settled into their dormitory. One of the students was admiring a girl named Ares, remarking on how beautiful she was. Kawachi looked at her and noted that despite her beauty, there was something dangerous in the way she carried herself, and suggested that others must have noticed it too. Siki heard this and warned Kawachi to be more careful with how she spoke and what she allowed herself to feel. He used Hidaka as an example, suggesting that once someone fell too deeply into something, there was no bringing them back, just like what had happened to him. Yukimura pushed back on Siki, clearly uncomfortable with the way he was treating the whole situation as though it were nothing serious or worth reflecting on. Siki acted as though he did not understand what Yukimura was referring to, which only made Yukimura more frustrated. Yukimura told him plainly to stop pretending, because everyone in the conversation knew they had been talking about Hidaka. Siki looked at him and dismissed the entire thing, expressing irritation at being spoken to about it all. Kawachi then turned to a student named Kita and pointed out that he had stood by silently during everything that had happened, and had even joined in on the bullying of Hidaka. Kita quietly insisted that what he had done was not bullying. Siki stepped in again and told Kawachi to stop pressing Kita, declaring that everything was already finished and done with. He said bluntly that Hidaka was never coming back, no matter how much any of them wanted to take responsibility for what had happened. As far as Siki was concerned, Hidaka was most likely already dead. Back in the dark underground space, Hidaka suddenly regained consciousness. He had no idea how long he had been out. The pain had been intense, but when he came to, he did not feel any different from before. He began to wonder whether his vision had somehow sharpened, and he tried to figure out what exactly the potion had done to him. He was frustrated that blacking out from the pain was the only noticeable result of something that had been hyped up so much. Then he noticed that there was one chest in the room he had not yet opened. He did not expect to find anything particularly impressive inside it, but he went ahead and slowly lifted the lid. The moment he did, the chest transformed into a monster with a massive fong-filled mouth that snapped down hard onto his arm. Blood hit the ground. Hidaka panicked and immediately sprinted away from it. The chest then closed its mouth and returned to looking like an ordinary box. With his arm wounded, Hidaka cast a healing spell on himself. He recognized the creature for what it was, a mimic, and felt the full weight of his situation pressing down on him. Healing himself was the only thing he could do. He was still the weakest class, and he had no idea how he was supposed to defeat a monster like that. It was then that he noticed something new on his status screen. A unique skill had appeared. The goddess Divine Protection combined with the god of Revenge's mischief, known as Mischievous Reversal. The description explained that this skill had been obtained by drinking the god of Revenge's secret medicine. The effect of the reversal could be applied to any target he chose, or it could be cancelled entirely. When applied to a status, anything that was positive would flip to negative. When applied to something that affected life, it would instead cause death. Hidaka decided to test it by trying to cast a healing spell on himself. As soon as he did, a voice announced that the god of Revenge's mischief had activated, and that the mischievous reversal had also activated alongside it. The healing spell had been reversed into something completely different, a magic technique called Waves of Erosion. The description of this technique explained that it used the skill user as the point of origin, from which waves would spread outward in every direction in a spherical formation, carrying with them the power of erosion. Whatever the waves touched would have its life force taken from it, and the size of the sphere could grow depending on how much magic power the user had. In other words, his healing magic had been turned into a destructive force. Hidaka stood there absorbing what had just happened. He turned and looked at the chest room, wondering whether he could actually beat the mimic now. He thought about simply not opening the chest again and avoiding a second attack. He could run, but he did not want to run. He wanted revenge for what the monster had done to his hand. He made up his mind. He went back, and the moment the chest transformed into the monster again, he immediately cast the Waves of Erosion on it. A thunderous boom filled the entire room. Hidaka let out a short, surprised laugh. He had simply reversed a spell, yet the sheer power behind it was genuinely impressive. He had won. Immediately after the fight, a notification sound chimed, and a message appeared telling him that the goddess divine protection had activated and that he was being asked to choose his rewards. Hidaka thought back and recalled that the goddess divine protection was indeed one of the skills he had. He had not fully understood it before, but now it seemed to be giving him a reward for winning the fight. The options presented to him included a skill called camouflage, which granted him the ability to freely change his own appearance. There was also a precious chest, described as a space chest capable of holding an unlimited number of goods. Additionally, there was a recovery medicine, which was a liquid that helped restore the body. He thought about the options. Camouflage sounded like an interesting ability, but the space chest felt more immediately practical. The mimic had been hiding so many useful things inside itself, and having a place to store everything he came across seemed far more convenient for now. Another notification then appeared. It told him that he had destroyed a mimic at level 500, and that he had gained enough experience to level up. Hidaka was floored. The creature he had just fought had been level 500. He had not had any idea just how powerful it actually was when he had faced it. He stared at his status screen, and then notification after notification began to go off in rapid succession. He was leveling up over and over again, one after another. Even the healing spell itself had gained enough experience to advance, and a notification informed him that his heal, which had been at level 1, had been upgraded all the way to its maximum level. More notifications flooded in after that. He had obtained a large number of new skills, and each of them had been maxed out immediately. Among them were skills related to healing waves, abnormal status effects, and attribute enhancement. His stats were climbing at a speed he had never seen, and he did not know what any of these numbers actually meant in the context of this world. He had no way of knowing whether his current level made him strong or weak by this world's standards. He thought about his classmates and wondered whether they might actually be even more powerful than he was now. Even after all of this, he decided to keep moving forward. Ahead of him was a massive door with an image of a goddess raising her hand carved into its surface. It gave him an uneasy feeling just looking at it. He tried pushing it open, but could not figure out how he had even gotten inside the place to begin with. Then a thought came to him. He used the waves of erosion on the door and carved a circular opening through it, bypassing the need to touch the door handles at all. On the other side of the door, something immediately caught his eye. A staff was floating in the middle of the room, suspended in the air all on its own, just like something out of a fantasy video game. He had waited a long time for a moment like this. After everything he had been through, he was finally going to get some real loot. Before he could get anywhere near the staff, the entire room began to shake. A massive armored knight materialized in the room, and Hidaka instantly understood that the floating staff had a guardian protecting it. The knight swung its enormous sword at Hidaka without hesitation, and he barely managed to throw himself out of the way in time. It was a dangerously close call, though he noticed that his body had become more physically resilient after all the leveling up he had just done. He activated an enhancement on his defense, aware that taking a direct hit from that sword could have ended very badly for him. He noticed that the knight's sword had become lodged and stuck. He saw his window of opportunity and immediately stretched out his arms and unleashed the waves of erosion directly at the guardian knight. The knight's legs were blown apart in an instant. Hidaka felt a flash of confidence, thinking the fight had gone far more smoothly than he had anticipated. Then something slammed into him from the side and sent him crashing hard into the wall. He had been kicked. He cast a healing spell on his arm and felt relieved that his enhanced defense had been active, because without it he knew the damage would have been far more severe. He reminded himself that he had gotten too confident too quickly. Despite everything that had happened, he was still a healer, and that fact had not changed. He was not happy about it, but he could not ignore it. He gathered himself and committed fully to the fight this time. He launched the waves of erosion at the guardian knight with everything he had, and half of the knight's body vanished in the blast. The room shook with the impact, and the guardian went down. Another round of notifications followed. Among the rewards he received was a rare skill called the Mimic's Life, which was described as something only possessed by high-level mimics, and which gave him the ability to falsify the information displayed on his own status screen. He also received a high-grade knight sword, described as a great sword that had belonged to a powerful knight, along with a matching high-grade knight shield, a large shield from the same source. A notification confirmed that he had successfully defeated the giant armor mimic at level 400, and that he had leveled up again as a result. He looked at the number on his screen. He was now level 212, which struck him as a strange and oddly specific number to land on. He also noticed that no matter how many skills he had stacked up, his magic skills were still only sitting at level 5. He thought about what the woman at the academy had told him back at the beginning, that he was the weakest. Even now, looking at the screen, that reminder stayed with him. He walked over to the floating staff and examined it. Its description identified it as a magic tool called the Wrath of Saints, a staff that contained intermediate holy magic of the holy light element. He decided to take it, reasoning that it would come in useful at some point down the road. At the Ares Greyberg Academy, inside maneuvering area number 1, the students were in the middle of their training session. The lecturer, a man named Philip Battler, checked on Yukimura after a magic circle suddenly exploded during practice. Yukimura assured his teacher that he was fine. Philip explained that the explosion had happened because the magic circle had been unstable. He urged Yukimura to put in more focus, pointing out that the strength behind Yukimura's explosion magic was enormous, which was exactly what made it so difficult for him to execute properly. Philip stressed that Yukimura needed to learn how to control it even without relying on magic circles and spoken spells, because without that level of control, he would never be able to hold his own against the demons. That was, after all, the duty that came with being a hero. Not far away, Siki and Kita were sitting together near a tree, watching Yukimura struggle through his training from distance. Siki spoke about the topic of magical power, noting that those who did not have enough of it found magic to be nothing more than a wasted effort. He then turned his attention to Yukimura specifically, criticizing him openly. In Siki's view, Yukimura tired out easily, lacked even a trace of real courage, and yet still had the nerve to carry the title of hero, which Siki found completely ridiculous. He went on to make a distinction between being given the title of hero and actually deserving it, suggesting that for most of them, the title was nothing more than a decoration with no real meaning behind it. Kita listened and responded by pointing out that there was not much anyone could do about it, since titles were not something they could simply change no matter how much they might want to. Siki agreed with that without any argument. Meanwhile, in an entirely different location, Hidaka was sitting down and drinking alcohol for the very first time in his life. He found a taste surprisingly acceptable. He had been fortunate enough to come across a pantry at some point during his wandering, which meant food and drink were not things he needed to worry about for the time being. As he sat there, he noticed a door nearby that he had not gone through yet. He thought about it for a moment and decided to try opening it. The moment the door was opened, a voice from inside addressed him and acknowledged that he had managed to make it there. Seated on a throne was a man who welcomed Hidaka and referred to him as an adventurer. Hidaka stepped inside and found himself in a place that looked completely unlike anything else he had encountered in his journey so far. The man then turned his attention to a creature nearby, a monster he called Zuri, and asked it how many years had passed since the last adventurer had appeared before him. Zuri answered that it had been 150 years. The man seemed to take a moment to absorb that fact, as though even he had lost track of just how long he had been waiting. He rose from his throne and announced that they would be having a celebration that day. Hidaka was caught completely off guard. Before he could react, the man walked toward him slowly, holding materials for a sword in his hand. He introduced himself as Cheyenne, the king of snakes, and told Hidaka that a deadly battle between them was about to begin. In the very next instant, Cheyenne closed the distance between them in a flash and drove his sword directly into Hidaka's stomach. Hidaka stood frozen in shock, unable to fully process what had just happened to him. Cheyenne raised his hand and reflected aloud that he had finally remembered what this feeling was like. He then pulled the sword out from Hidaka's stomach and expressed his disappointment with the situation, saying that waiting 150 years only to face an opponent of this level was deeply unsatisfying. He began walking away slowly, commenting that the quality of adventurers had fallen to a truly low point. As he walked away, Cheyenne suddenly heard the sound of healing magic being cast behind him. He turned around and saw that Hidaka was using it on himself. Cheyenne asked whether Hidaka was a priest. Zuri stepped in to correct him, clarifying that Hidaka was not a priest but a healer. Cheyenne was genuinely surprised by this and wondered out loud how it was even possible for a healer to have made it all the way to this place entirely on his own. Zuri added that there was something else strange about Hidaka and began to say something about his skill. But before it could finish its sentence, Hidaka fired a bolt of holy light directly at Zuri. The attack killed it instantly. A notification appeared before Hidaka, informing him that the goddess divine protection had activated and that he was to choose his reward. Cheyenne was enraged by what had just happened to Zuri and moved immediately to attack Hidaka. Before Cheyenne could reach him, Hidaka cast the waves of erosion. The attack connected, and when Cheyenne reappeared close to Hidaka and demanded to know what kind of magic that was, he looked down and realized that his sword had been broken by it. Cheyenne began to tremble at the sight of his broken sword. Hidaka found this reaction disproportionate to what had happened, since it was only a sword. But Cheyenne's anger only deepened. He pointed out that Hidaka had killed Zuri, broken his sword, and was now looking at him with what Cheyenne interpreted as mockery. He warned Hidaka in no uncertain terms that leaving this place alive was not going to be an option for him. Hidaka cast a healing spell to tend to his wounds while quietly acknowledging to himself that his opponent was moving at a speed he simply could not track with his eyes. Cheyenne, still standing at a distance, studied Hidaka and thought carefully about the magic that had killed Zuri. He suspected it had come from the staff Hidaka was carrying, but something about the power behind it did not line up with having a supporting item. He held the broken pieces of his sword out toward Hidaka and demanded to know who he really was. Hidaka repeated what Zuri had already told him, that he was a healer. Cheyenne was not satisfied with that answer. He accused Hidaka of hiding something and used a flash step to close the gap between them instantly, slashing Hidaka across the back with his broken sword. He stated plainly that he would keep cutting into him until he gave a real answer. Hidaka insisted again that he had already told him the truth. Cheyenne called him a liar and slashed him again, pointing out that Zuri had started to say something unusual about Hidaka before being killed, and that Hidaka had clearly shot it down to prevent that information from coming out. Cheyenne shouted that there was absolutely no way a healer could use offensive magic, and that Hidaka, had to be concealing something far more significant than he was letting on. Hidaka looked back at Shane, battered and bleeding, and repeated once more that he was a healer. Shane grew more and more frustrated, pointing out that Hidaka had not even bothered to give his name and was simply repeating the same occupation over and over again like it was the only answer he had. Hidaka paused for a moment. He thought about Shane and wondered whether anything he said would ever actually be believed. He then thought about something Siki had said to him back before everything had changed, the comment about being better off as a shut-in. Something shifted in him. He looked at Shane and made a decision. From that point forward, he would give himself a new name. He would call himself Neat. He declared it firmly, telling Shane that his name was Neat and that he intended to make that name known. He would become someone famous under that name, and through it he would get his revenge on every single person who had wronged him, letting them all be brought down by someone who bore that name. Shane appeared completely baffled by what he was hearing, questioning whether he had understood correctly, and demanded once again to know what Hidaka truly was. Hidaka raised his voice and stated clearly, one more time, that he was a healer. But before he could say anything more, Shane cut him off, declared that he had grown bored of the entire exchange, and in an instant that Hidaka did not even register, slashed his body multiple times in rapid succession. Shane announced that it was over and raised his sword above his head, preparing to deliver the final blow. Hidaka lay there and asked himself whether this was truly how it was going to end. He had not done anything yet. He had not accomplished a single thing. There was still so much left undone. And yet here he was, with a sword raised above him and no clear way out. In the very last moment before Shane could bring his sword down, Hidaka summoned whatever strength he had left and unleashed the waves of erosion. The attack landed, and Shane was thrown to the ground. Lying there, Shane looked up at Hidaka in genuine shock, realizing that even after everything he had put him through, Hidaka had still managed to find the strength to cast magic. As he lay on the ground, Shane reflected quietly to himself that after 150 years of waiting, it seemed as though it was actually he who had grown weaker over time. Hidaka responded with clear exasperation, pointing out that Shane had beaten him half to death and was still somehow framing the situation as though he should feel grateful. Shane let out a laugh at that. He then addressed Hidaka by his chosen name, Neat, and gave him a piece of advice. He told him that from that point forward, it would be in his best interest to keep his true identity hidden from others. Hidaka was confused by this and wanted to know what Shane meant. Shane explained his reasoning. He himself had once been widely known and feared across the entire kingdom, a king of snakes who had lived for hundreds of years, and yet he had just been defeated by someone standing in front of him. He asked Hidaka directly whether he was truly just a healer, seemingly still wrestling with the reality of what had just happened. Hidaka confirmed it once again, and this time Shane finally accepted it as the truth. Shane went on to explain that despite healer being a low-grade occupation that was generally assumed to be weak, Hidaka clearly possessed magic of unusual power and carried qualities that were difficult to explain. He warned him that anyone who became aware of this would inevitably want it for themselves. A person of real power always became a target, and because the expectation for someone of a low-grade occupation was that they would be harmless and weak, concealing his true abilities behind that image was the smartest path available to him. Still lying on the ground, Shane added one final thought, that this world had no patience or mercy for those who were foolish enough not to protect themselves. Hidaka was taken aback by the sincerity in what Shane was telling him. He then decided to ask something that had been sitting in the back of his mind. He brought up the name God of Revenge and asked Shane whether he had ever heard of that person. Something changed in Shane's expression the moment he heard those words. A memory seemed to surface in him, and after a brief pause, he broke into a smile and then into laughter. He said that he understood now, that it all made sense, and that he could hardly believe it. He told Hidaka that it had been a very long time since he had heard that name, and that hearing it again brought back something distant and familiar. When Hidaka pressed him for more information, Shane told him what he knew, which was not much. He explained that the God of Revenge was the code name of an adventurer who had carried some kind of curse. That was the extent of what he knew. He told Hidaka to travel to other lands and keep moving forward, because eventually the meaning behind it would become clear to him on its own. Hidaka was surprised to hear this, and privately suspected that Shane actually knew more than he was letting on. Before the conversation could continue further, Shane asked Hidaka what his real name was. Hidaka told him. His name was Hidako Masamune. Upon hearing the name, something shifted visibly in Shane. He repeated the name quietly, and his manner changed in a way that was difficult to place. Hidaka noticed this and wanted to ask why Shane was suddenly behaving so differently from the way he had been before. But before he could pursue that question, a notification chimed. The goddess Divine Protection had activated again, and he was being prompted to choose his next reward. Hidaka tried to get Shane's attention, but Shane gave no response. He was completely still. Hidaka requested the sword as his chosen reward, and it appeared before him immediately. A notification confirmed that he had received the Serpent Sword Killjewels. He looked at it, then looked over at Shane's motionless body on the ground, and quietly wondered whether someone like him, a healer, could even make proper use of a sword like that. He decided it did not matter and took it with him regardless. 2 more notifications followed. from the creature known as the Mad Izuri. He received a skill called the Magic Eye of Truth, which granted him the ability to see the status of any enemy he looked at. It also came with a magic called Dark Beam, which allowed beams of dark element energy to be fired directly from the eyes of the person using it. From Cheyenne, the King of Serpents, he received a unique skill called Flash, which appeared to be the very source behind the extreme speed Cheyenne had demonstrated throughout their fight. Hidaka stood there and looked down at Cheyenne's body, noticing with some confusion that it had not disappeared the way he might have expected. He glanced toward a staircase nearby and decided that figuring out the reason for that could wait until after he had found a way out. He began walking toward the stairs, hoping they might lead somewhere outside. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to everything that had happened and everything that was still waiting for him. No matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the road became, he was going back. He was not going to die before he had the chance to face every single person who had wronged him. That was not something he was willing to let go of. His status screen reflected everything he had become up to that point. Hidako Masamune, level 697. Occupation, healer. Race, human. His status listed Otherworld Obsession Syndrome. His titles were Reincarnated, Friend of the God of Revenge, and Friend of the King of Serpents. It had found a way to pass the time by getting drunk, then using magic to sober himself up, and then getting drunk all over again. All the while he kept climbing, going up one staircase after another without any clear idea of where they were leading him. The stairs seemed to go on endlessly, and he genuinely had no answer to where they might end. Then without any warning, he heard something. It sounded like a voice calling out to someone named Jeek, warning them to watch behind themselves. Nit registered the sound, but barely had time to process it before he felt the sensation of wind rushing past his ears. He had no idea what was happening. One moment he had been on the stairs, and the next something had changed. He tried to work out whether he had been teleported somehow, though he was certain he had not touched anything that would have caused it. He looked up and around himself, and the moment he saw the open sky above him, a wave of relief and excitement hit him all at once. He shouted out loud, celebrating the fact that he had finally gotten out of that place. He was free. With genuine enthusiasm, he declared to himself that his adventure in another world was about to begin. His excitement was immediately interrupted by the sound of people nearby in the middle of an argument. A man named Alfred was scolding a woman named Eliza, telling her she needed to stay alert at all times. Eliza was insisting that she was. Nit became aware of them and looked in their direction. Among the group, there was a man standing in the middle who noticed Nit and fixed his gaze on him. Nit looked back at the group, and while Alfred and Eliza continued their argument, Nit studied them and wondered to himself whether they were even human. One of them noticed Nit standing there and demanded to know who he was. Before any real answer could be given, the man wearing a black robe spoke up. He said that it did not matter who Nit was, because there was a possibility that Nit had overheard their conversation, and because of that he needed to be dealt with immediately. Nit tried to stop things before they escalated, calling out to the man in the black robe and telling him to put his weapon away so that they could at least talk first. The man ignored him entirely and slashed at Nit without hesitation. Nit dodged the attack cleanly, and the man was left visibly stunned because Nit had seemed to vanish in the space of a single blink. In the very next moment, Nit reappeared behind Eliza with his sword drawn and pressed against her neck. The man could not understand how or when Nit had moved into that position. Nit told everyone calmly not to move. He looked at the man and reminded him that he had now told him twice to put his sword away. He then addressed the other person in the group as well, telling him to do the same. Eliza, even with a sword at her neck, spoke to a member of their group named Jeek and told him quietly that they had lost this one. Jeek stood there and thought about what had just happened. Nit had come so close to him without Jeek feeling even the slightest trace of his presence. The final movement had been completely invisible to him. Jeek made his decision. He drove his sword into the ground as a gesture of surrender and told Nit that he was giving up, asking him to release Eliza in return. Nit was caught off guard by how straightforward the surrender was and immediately suspected it might be some kind of trick. Jeek assured him that he had no intention of fighting anymore. Nit asked him to make it a promise, and Jeek did. Satisfied, Nit gave Eliza a light pat on the back, returned his sword to its sheath, said his goodbyes, and turned to walk away. Jeek called after him and asked him to wait. Nit turned and pointed out that just moments ago this person had wanted him dead, and now he wanted something from him. Jeek introduced himself, but Nit cut him off and told him plainly that he had no interest in knowing his name. Jeek pressed on regardless. He explained that there was something he needed help with, and that he wanted to invite Nit to come along with them. Nit looked at them both, decided the whole thing sounded like more trouble than it was worth, waved his hand dismissively, and told them to find someone else. Before he could take another step, Jeek hurled a fireball at him. Nit dodged it immediately and told him to stop, genuinely taken aback. Jeek launched another spell, this time a flame hammer, and continued pressing him. Jeek explained that he simply wanted to test a measure of Nit's power. Nit wanted to know what class Jeek was. Jeek refused to answer, which Nit understood was simply the common sense of this world. People did not freely share that kind of information. So Nit decided to use his devil eye to check Jeek's status on his own. What he saw told him that Jeek was a level 48 human with the title Child of Dragon, a unique skill called Dragon Remon's Power, and a long list of magic techniques that included Blaze Guardian Flame, Flame Blade, Flame Hammer, First Class Lightning, Thunder Spear, Lightning Sonic, Feathered Thunder, Lightning Thunder, and Thunder Emperor's Fury. Nit quietly envied the range and variety of magic Jeek had at his disposal. Jeek responded to what he sensed as Nit's unspoken judgment by telling him not to take him for a fool. He was not going to be underestimated. Nit thought back to what he had done earlier while climbing the stairs. He had applied the mischievous reversal to all of his magic spells. The reversal of attribute enhancement had produced a skill he called Soul Break. He had read its description carefully, but found no information about its range or the scale of its effect on targets. The only way to know how it worked was to test it in an actual fight. That was the conclusion he had reached, and so he had left it reversed, keeping it ready. Now, watching the flame that Jeek had thrown at him hanging in the air, Nit decided that if this was the scale of magic Jeek was working with, it was the perfect moment to find out what Soul Break could do. Jeek watched in disbelief and demanded to know what Nit was doing. Nit raised his hand toward the incoming fire and cast Soul Break. The enormous ball of flame simply vanished. Jeek stood there in complete shock. The magic circle had been destroyed. He could not wrap his head around it and began to wonder whether the person in front of him was even human. Before the situation could turn hostile again, Eliza rushed forward and grabbed Nit's hand. She pleaded with him desperately, begging him to forgive Jeek, who she said was a precious friend to them. She acknowledged that Jeek was the one who had started the confrontation, but asked Nit to spare him, saying she would do absolutely anything he asked in exchange. The sight of someone throwing themselves in front of another person to protect them brought a memory to Nit's mind. He thought of his classmates and the bullying he had endured from them. He let out a short laugh at the irony of the situation, because in this moment he looked like the threatening one, like the bad guy. He turned away from them and said to himself that he was not going to behave like Siki. He began walking away. Jeek called out to him again and asked if he would consider becoming their comrade. He explained that from the very beginning, before any of the confrontation had taken place, he had already been able to tell that Nit was not an ordinary person. The testing had been deliberate. Jeek had been confident that if Nit was who he suspected he was, he would be able to dodge the attacks without any difficulty. Jeek admitted that what he was about to say might sound selfish, but he explained that they were part of a certain organization and were in genuine need of someone strong. He told Nit that they would be willing to give him anything he wanted in return, whether that was money or anything else. Nit replied that he did not need anything from them, and that even if he did, there was nothing they could offer him that would satisfy what he truly wanted. Eliza tried to pull Jeek back, telling him they could not drag someone else into their situation. But Jeek said plainly that they were running out of time. They needed someone with real strength to join their cause. Jeek then took out a ring and held it out to Nit. He explained that it was a communication device. By channeling power into the ring, two people could communicate with each other across great distances. Jeek told Nit that he did not need to make any decision right away, but asked him to at least think about it. He then revealed the name of their organization, Dragonheart. Their goal was to eradicate corruption and bring peace to the world. Nit looked at them and asked whether they had mistaken him for one of the people they were fighting against. Jeek then told him what had brought them to this area in the first place. A nearby duke's house had been raided. When they had arrived at the scene, there was no one left alive. It had been a complete massacre. Nit said he understood and accepted the ring, storing it away by opening his dimensional storage. Alfred immediately reacted with surprise, asking whether what he was seeing was actually a dimensional storage. Nit asked whether it was particularly rare, and Alfred confirmed that it was the first time he had personally ever seen one. Nit then asked the group what their next move was. Jeek told him they were heading to a place called Grey Belka. He explained that about a month ago, a country there had successfully summoned heroes, and they were going to look into it. Nit was struck by this. In his own reckoning, it had only been a few days since he himself had been transported. Hearing that an entire month had passed on the outside was jarring. Jeek asked where Nit was headed. Nit said he was planning to go to town. Eliza asked if he was going to Razhausen, and told him that on foot it would take about 3 days to get there. Jeek then asked for his name. Nit thought about it for a moment. Since Jeek and the others were heading toward Grey Belka, which was connected to the Summon Heroes, he decided it was safer not to give his real name. He introduced himself as Nito. A little while later, Nit was deep into his walk and finding it thoroughly boring. He had been walking for about an hour, and absolutely nothing had happened. It was not the adventurous experience he had been imagining. Then a rustling came from the bushes ahead, and a pack of wolves emerged, growling and positioning themselves in front of him. Nit felt a spark of genuine excitement. This was it. This was exactly the kind of thing another world was supposed to offer. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to blow off some of the tension that had been building up inside him. Before doing anything else, he checked their status using his devil eye. They were level 8 hunting wolves, described as monsters skilled at hunting that use their fangs and claws to attack. He immediately felt that the level was surprisingly low. Given that Jeek had been level 48, these wolves seemed far below what he had been expecting. He decided the best approach was to finish them off quickly and collect whatever loot they dropped. Before he could move, a voice from somewhere nearby shouted at him to get down. A woman came rushing past him and slashed through the wolves one after another with speed and precision, cutting each of them down in rapid succession. When it was over, she turned to Nit and said it had been a close call, then asked if he was all right. Nit thanked her for stepping in, going along with the idea that she had saved him. Her name was Sierra Ekarlat, level 32, and her title was White King's Knight. However, Sierra was looking at him carefully, and she noted that he did not seem particularly pleased about being rescued. Before anything more could be said, a carriage arrived and called out to Sierra. The man driving it introduced himself as William Vector, a merchant, and the person accompanying him was his escort, a man named Keith, who offered a simple greeting. Sierra gave her own name in return, and Nit introduced himself as Nito. Sierra remarked that it was an unusual name, and Nit noticed quietly that she seemed to be keeping a watchful eye on him. As they traveled together, William explained the situation to Nito. He and his group were in the middle of transporting goods to Razhausen, and since he and Sierra happened to know each other, he had offered her a ride to the city in exchange for her acting as a guard for the journey. Nito apologized for adding himself to the group, but William brushed it off warmly, saying that a traveler could never have too many guards on the road. He also admitted that Sierra's reaction earlier, when she had leaped into action the moment she sensed a presence nearby, had genuinely startled him. He said it with admiration, expressing that witnessing one of the famous White King's Knights in action with his own eyes was something he had not expected. Sierra dismissed the compliment lightly, saying it had not been anything remarkable. Nito, curious, asked what exactly the White King's Knights were. William seemed surprised that Nito did not already know. He explained that in Razhausen, the royal capital, a king had ruled the land for many generations. The current king's name was Arnold Razhausen. The White King's Knights were a unit that served directly under the king himself. William noted that in truth, very little was commonly known about them, because they almost never appeared in public. Because of that, actually encountering one of them in a place like this was something close to a miracle. Sierra smiled and told William he was overstating things. Nito, watching her, thought to himself that he had not expected to come across someone like her either. With her silver hair, she looked exactly like the kind of heroine one would find in a fantasy story set in another world. Sierra then turned the conversation toward William, saying that he was quite well known himself. William deflected modestly, but Sierra pushed back on his humility. She told him plainly that there was no one in the world of trade who did not know the name William Vector, a great merchant widely recognized across many countries for dealing in rare and valuable goods. That reputation, she pointed out, was also the exact reason why someone like him needed guards when traveling. William then turned his attention to Nito and asked what had brought him to such a remote area. Nito said casually that he had thought he would go on a bit of an adventure. William connected the dots and asked if Nito was planning to head to the guild. Nito was surprised to hear the word, but also quietly relieved. He had thought guilds would exist in a world like this, and hearing it confirmed felt like a familiar landmark. It was the kind of place that people in stories like his always started from, the beginning of something bigger. He told William that yes, that had been his plan. Sierra offered to guide him there once they arrived in the city. She then asked Nito what his class was. The question caught him slightly off guard. He thought about how casually she had asked it, as though it were ordinary small talk. He remembered Shane's warning about keeping his identity hidden, and he thought about how Jeek had refused to share his own class when asked. He considered lying and claiming to be a swordsman or a sorcerer, but looking at Sierra, he did not think she would believe it. He told her the truth. He was a healer. William expressed surprise and asked if Nito was planning to join a party with other adventurers. Nito said yes, if he could find one willing to take him. Sierra offered to help him ask around at the guild when they arrived, adding that their meeting felt like something more than just coincidence. She acknowledged that being a healer made the path of an adventurer a harder one to walk, and that there would likely be difficult moments ahead, but she was confident he would find people to adventure with. She went on to say that there were many people in the world who lacked confidence in their own class, and that someone like Nito, choosing to push forward regardless, would serve as an inspiration to others around him. Nito smiled at her words and told her he would do his best. He noticed as he said it that Sierra had a genuinely optimistic way of looking at things. Sierra then gave him a practical suggestion. She told him he ought to consider learning swordsmanship. Since healers could not use offensive magic, picking up a weapon or two would not go to waste. Nito was surprised to hear that a healer could even use a sword, and asked if that was actually possible. Sierra told him that of course it was. Swords, bows, axes, these were things that anyone could pick up and learn to use regardless of their class. This made Nito think back to what the woman named Ares had said to him back in the kingdom, the suggestion that his class did not decide everything about him. He followed up by asking Sierra whether someone like him could cast offensive spells like a fireball or a lightning strike. Sierra said that would be genuinely difficult for him. She explained that while it varied from person to person, healers who used support magic and sorcerers who used offensive magic generally had different natures of magical power at their core, and that difference was not easy to bridge. Nito then asked about attribute enhancement, mentioning that he had already learned that particular spell. Sierra clarified that attribute enhancement and magic attributes were two entirely separate things. Attribute enhancement was a support magic that could only be applied to weapons. It did not require a magic formula to cast, and the attributes it generated did not carry magical power in the same way that true elemental magic did. The two operated on fundamentally different principles. Nito listened carefully, but honestly could not follow even a basic part of what she was explaining. The distinction went over his head entirely. Sierra added, however, that it was genuinely rare to encounter a healer who had learned attribute enhancement at all. That alone made her recommendation for him to learn swordsmanship even stronger, because it suggested he had qualities that most healers did not. Nito said that he supposed he might give it a try. Sierra offered, if he did not mind, to teach him herself. Their journey was interrupted when they reached a place called Tanya Village, where William suggested they stop for a rest. After stepping down from the carriage, they noticed that a group of villagers had gathered together, and the air around them felt heavy and troubled. The villagers noticed the newcomers and asked who they were. A little while later, after making their situation known, the group spoke with an elderly man from the village. He explained that they had stopped by on their way to Razhausen and offered his deepest apologies that the village was in no condition to welcome guests at the moment. The old man told them what had happened. The village had been attacked by thieves, and every woman in the village had been taken away. The remaining villagers were gathered together because they were determined to go and get everyone back. They could not simply sit and do nothing. Sierra thought carefully about what she had heard. She explained that thieves and ordinary bandits operated differently from one another. Most thieves had their own connections to people who dealt in slaves, which meant that the longer they waited, the worse the situation would become for the women who had been taken. Even so, Sierra told the gathered villagers to stand down and let her group handle it instead. The villagers were startled by this, and the old man reminded her that they were guests who had only just arrived. William stepped in and told the old man not to worry, assuring him that they would take care of the situation. He told Sierra she could take Keith along, as he would be able to help. Sierra then asked if anyone in the village knew where the thieves might have gone. At that moment, a young boy stepped forward from the crowd. His name was Jack, and he said that he knew the way. The people around him were surprised. Jack explained that when the attack happened, all the adults had been out on a hunt. He had followed the thieves on his own, tracked them up a mountain, and found their camp. He had seen his mother and the other women from the village locked up inside cages. The village chief gently reminded Jack that his mother was his only family, and that she had been taken from him that very day. Jack stood firm. With clear determination in his face, he told Sierra that he would guide them to the camp, and that he wanted to save his mother and everyone else who had been taken. Sometime later, the group reached a position where they could see the thieves' camp below them, with the caged villagers visible inside it. Sierra told Jack that it was too dangerous for him to go any further, and that he should leave the rest to them and return to the village. She checked to make sure he could find his way back on his own, and Jack turned and headed back. Nit hid among the trees and looked down at the camp below. The whole scene felt strangely like something out of a game, like a mission event that had been placed in front of him. He felt the nerves of it settle into him. Sierra told him the plan. She and Keith would handle the guards positioned around the outer edges of the camp, and once they were done, they would send him a signal. She asked him to stay where he was and wait until then. Nit was a little confused by the role he had been given. Sierra clarified her reasoning. Since healers were not suited for attacking, she wanted him to focus on providing support rather than fighting directly. Nit agreed to that. To himself, he thought that it made sense on the surface, since as far as Sierra knew, he was just a healer. Even though his level was far higher than hers, she was already showing signs of being cautious and watchful around him. He decided it was better to keep a low profile for now. Besides, he was genuinely curious to see what a White King's Knight was truly capable of when she was fighting at full strength. Back at Tanya Village, the chief stood anxiously, hoping that everyone who had gone to the camp would come back safely. William tried to ease his worry, telling him to have faith in them. Keith was with them, and on top of that, Sierra, despite her young age, was one of the White King's Knights. At the thieves' camp, Sierra and Keith moved through the enemy efficiently and took down the thieves one after another. Nito watched with genuine amazement. Sierra brushed it off as nothing worth making a fuss about. With the guards dealt with, they opened the cage and freed the captured villagers. Sierra gathered everyone together and told them they were heading back to the village and to stay close and follow along. Sierra noted with some relief that the majority of the thieves did not appear to be at the camp. Nito agreed, but as he looked around at the scene, something nagged at him. Even though he had not done a single thing during the whole operation, the whole rescue had gone far too smoothly. It fell off somehow, too easy to be real. Sierra then told the group to move out and to stay alert as they went. Before anyone could take more than a few steps, a voice cut through the air, demanding to know where they thought they were going. The thieves' leader stepped out into view, accompanied by the rest of his men. They had been surrounded without anyone noticing. Sierra immediately recognized that things were not going to be as simple as they had looked. The thieves' leader laughed and said that of course it would not be that easy, asking who in the world would simply allow their goods to be taken without putting up a fight. Nito quickly pieced together what had happened. The whole thing had been a trap from the beginning. Sierra looked at the leader more carefully and recognized him. She called out his name, Oliver Joe. The man was visibly surprised that she knew who he was. Oliver Joe had once been a knight of the Razhausen royal capital and the captain of a punitive force known as the Band of Ashes. 2 years prior, however, Oliver had suddenly and without warning slaughtered every single one of his own men, set part of the city ablaze, and then vanished without a trace. Oliver received Sierra's summary of his past with a casual kind of gratitude and told her that he was now in the business of thieving. Sierra pressed him, wanting to understand why someone of his ability and background had thrown everything away and chosen this path. Oliver responded with a question of his own, asking what the point of pledging loyalty to a country or a king actually was. He said he had no interest in being used by others. Sierra pushed back firmly, saying that the current king was a person of genuine generosity and good character. Oliver then asked her directly whether an order from the king was something absolute and beyond question. He told her that the people he had killed in the past had carried the same look in their eyes that she had now. The empty, hollow look of someone who had surrendered their will entirely to a nation and called it loyalty. He looked at Sierra and remarked that she was a fine woman and that she would likely fetch a good price. He then ordered his men to kill everyone else. Sierra immediately told Nito to gather the villagers and get them moving, and then she broke into a run and charged straight at the enemy. She unleashed an ice wind storm that instantly swept through a portion of the thieves, taking several of them down in one move. Oliver watched her with a grin, saying that was exactly what he expected from a White King's knight. Sierra was caught off guard that he already knew what she was. Oliver told her it was not hard to figure out. Even setting aside how young she looked, her armor alone was enough to give it away to anyone paying attention. While Sierra was engaged with the thieves, one of them broke away from the fight and rushed directly at Nito. Before the attacker could land a single blow, Keith stepped in and blocked the strike, then used a skill called Blanche to take the thief down. Sierra called out her thanks to Keith without breaking focus, and Keith reminded her to keep her attention on her own fight. Nito stood there quietly impressed, thinking to himself that Keith was capable of quite a lot when fighting offensively. Oliver stood back and watched his men fall one by one to Sierra and Keith. He sighed with visible frustration, muttering about how much he suffered having such useless people under him. Sierra finished off the last remaining thief, and for a moment it seemed like it was over. Then a shout pierced the air. One of the villagers cried out in alarm, and all eyes turned to see Jack. His hands and feet had been tied up. He was calling out desperately, shouting for his mother and for someone to help him. Sierra was visibly shaken, unable to understand how Jack had ended up back in the middle of everything after she had sent him away. Oliver laughed at the sight of it and pointed out the obvious. She had sent him back to the village entirely on his own. She should have made sure someone actually walked him back to safety. Leaving a child alone in the middle of enemy territory, Oliver said, was exactly the kind of mistake that foolish people made. He questioned out loud whether someone who made that kind of error could really call herself a White King's knight. Jack cried out for Sierra and for his mother, frightened and helpless. Oliver grabbed the boy by the hair and told him harshly to be quiet. He complained that children were unbearably loud, that the noise felt like it was piercing straight through his ears and making his blood pressure climb. He drew his knife and brought it to Jack's neck, saying that it made him want to just kill all of them and be done with it. Nito felt the shock of the moment hit him. Sierra, watching from where she stood, realized in an instant that she was not going to reach Jack in time. Then, in less than the span of a single blink, Nito moved. He snatched the knife clean out of Oliver's hand and drove it into Oliver's neck before anyone had even registered that he had moved. Oliver himself had no idea what had happened. One moment the knife had been in his hand, and the next he simply felt it buried in his own neck. Oliver collapsed to the ground and did not move again. Sierra and Keith stood frozen in shock. Jack looked up at Nito and asked in a small, confused voice when exactly he had gotten there. Nito himself was taken aback by the reaction around him. Sierra, all the villagers, everyone stood completely still and silent, staring at him with wide eyes and open mouths. Nito had no idea what to say to any of them. He simply suggested that they should probably head back, pointing out that the people at the village were surely worried about them by now. Keith smiled quietly and agreed that it was time to go. Before Nito could take a single step, a hand grabbed his shoulder from behind. It was Sierra, and the look on her face was anything but friendly. She told him plainly that she needed an explanation before they went anywhere. Nito asked what she meant. Sierra raised her voice and let everything out at once. She reminded him that he was supposed to be a healer. She demanded to know what that move had been, how the knife had ended up in Oliver's neck when he had stolen it from Oliver's hand, and most importantly, how he had crossed the distance between them in an instant without anyone seeing him move. She stated directly that he was hiding something and told him to show her his status. Nito stood there quietly overwhelmed by the rapid stream of questions coming at him. He had no answer ready for any of them. He gave her a small smile and suggested that they head back to the village first and talk there. Sierra told him firmly that he was going to explain everything the moment they returned. As they walked, Nito caught Keith looking at him from the side. He tried to lighten the moment by telling Keith that the skill he had used earlier was really something impressive. Keith looked back at him with a slight smirk and said that it was nothing compared to what Nito had just done. Nito realized quietly that he was not going to find any support from Keith on this one. As he walked with the group, Nito turned the situation over in his mind. He wondered whether he should have simply stayed hidden and kept his strength out of sight. But then he thought about what would have happened if he had done nothing. Jack would have died. He knew that Shane's advice about concealing himself was sound, and he understood why it mattered. But he closed his fist tightly and told himself that what he had done was the right thing. It had to have been. When they returned to Tanya village, The chief and the rest of the villagers came out to welcome them back with joy and relief. The reunions that followed were warm and full of emotion, with people rushing back to their families and holding them close. As Nito watched the scene around him, he noticed something. Off to one side, a young woman was standing completely still and alone. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, and she had not moved toward anyone. Nito approached her and asked if she was all right and whether she was not going to join her family. She gave him no response at all, simply ignored him. Nito stood there for a moment, unsure what to make of her. One of the villagers noticed the two of them and came over to explain. The girl was not from their village. She had already been inside the cage when the women of the village were brought there by the thieves. The villagers had tried to speak with her during their captivity, but she had remained completely silent throughout. No one knew where she had come from or how she had ended up in that cage to begin with. The villager asked Sierra if something was wrong. Sierra said she understood and gently approached the girl. She spoke to her in a soft, reassuring tone, telling her that everything was all right now and that she would make sure she was looked after. Sierra told the girl that they were traveling to the capital city the following day, and that she would put in a request at the town hall to arrange for the girl to be sent back to her hometown. The girl remained completely silent. Nito looked at her and offered a different kind of option. He told her that if she did not want to go through the capital, she was free to make her own way back, and if she did not know how to get home, he would take her there himself. Sierra leaned close to Nito and whispered to him, asking if he could possibly have said that in a gentler way. Before anyone could say anything more, the girl reached out and quietly grabbed hold of Nito's robe. Sierra's eyebrow twitched visibly at the sight of it. She told Nito flatly that she was leaving the girl in his care, then turned and walked away. Nito looked down at the girl and muttered to himself that she had just made him look like the difficult one in this situation. The girl then spoke. She said she did not like the other woman. Nito was surprised to hear her voice at all, and asked her why she had been staying silent the entire time if she was perfectly capable of speaking. The girl seemed to mumble something in response. Then a gust of wind passed through, and the hood that had been covering her face was lifted away. The girl introduced herself as Totrika. Nito stared at her for a moment, genuinely caught off guard by how beautiful she was. Toa noticed he had gone quiet, and asked if he was even listening. He quickly pulled himself together and confirmed that he had heard her, repeating her name back to her. From a short distance away, Sierra was watching the two of them with a suspicious look on her face. Nito and Toa stood facing each other, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he felt an unusual reluctance to be dishonest with her. He told her his real name was Masamune, but asked her to call him Nito when others were around. Toa replied simply that she understood and would do so. Nito asked her how she had ended up being captured. Toa told him she was not entirely sure. When she had become aware of her surroundings, she had already been in a forest somewhere, being carried away by the thieves. She had no memory of what had happened before that moment. Night fell over the village. William and Keith sat together, and William brought up the events of the day. He expressed admiration for Sierra's swordsmanship, remarking that her skill was entirely deserving of her place among the White King's knights. Keith agreed. He said he had felt the killing intent radiating from her during the fight, and that it had been truly formidable. He acknowledged openly that he would be no match for her. Keith then shifted the conversation to a more pressing matter. He said the real question was about the healer, Nito. William responded sympathetically, saying that trying to make a life as an adventurer with the healer class was going to be an incredibly difficult road, one full of obstacles at every turn. Keith shook his head. He said in a quiet but very serious tone that that was not going to be the problem at all. He told William directly that Nito was an absolute monster. William looked at Keith and smiled, letting the weight of that statement settle over him. For Keith, a man of few words and careful judgment, to speak about someone that way meant something significant. William thought to himself that this was going to be very interesting indeed. The next morning, William greeted the group with a warm smile, though he quickly noticed that Sierra was directing a sharp glare his way and wisely chose not to draw attention to it. They left Tanya village early and got back on the road toward Razhausen. Inside the carriage, Sierra wasted no time in reminding Nito that she had still not received the explanation she had been promised the night before. Nito was caught off guard, having quietly hoped the matter might have been left behind with the village. Sierra pushed him directly, wanting to know how he had managed to defeat Oliver when his class was supposed to be that of a healer. She made it clear she had no intention of dropping the subject until she got an answer that actually made sense to her. She even questioned outright whether he was truly a healer at all. Nito told her that he was. To back it up, he brought up his status screen, but he was careful to show only a small and selected part of it, presenting himself as nothing more than a level 3 healer. Sierra studied it and admitted that it appeared to be genuine. Nito told her he had no reason to lie about something like that. He then offered his explanation, telling her that he had used a skill called Godspeed, which allowed him to move fast enough to cross the space between himself and Oliver and take the knife before anyone could track the movement. Sierra read the skill description for herself and found that it lined up with everything she had witnessed. She apologized to Nito for having doubted him. Nito said it was fine and that he was just glad she understood now. What he kept entirely to himself was the wave of relief he felt knowing that the mimic's life skill had done exactly what it was supposed to. Without it, his real status would have been laid out in front of her, and the conversation would have gone somewhere far more complicated. A short while later, William called their attention to the view outside the carriage window. They were nearly there. The royal capital of Razhausen came into view, surrounded by massive walls that rose high into the sky. Nito stared at it with wide eyes, taking in the sheer size of it. Beyond the gates, the streets were packed with people moving in every direction, and the whole place hummed with the energy of a city that never really stopped. William told the group that this was where he and they would go their separate ways. He had goods to deliver to the castle and could not delay. He expressed his hope that their paths would cross again someday. Nito gave a respectful bow and thanked him sincerely for the ride and for his kindness throughout the journey. Sierra then gathered Nito and Totrika and told them it was time to head to the Adventurers Guild. They arrived at the guild not long after. The moment they stepped inside, Nito took in the atmosphere of the place. It was part guild and part tavern, filled with adventurers who were eating, drinking, and making noise as they celebrated whatever their recent work had earned them. Sierra moved with purpose and led Nito straight to the receptionist counter. The receptionist explained the registration process clearly and asked Nito to place his hand on a magic crystal ball so that his status could be read and confirmed. Nito felt a quiet but sharp stab of anxiety at this. He could not afford to be exposed here, not in a room full of strangers. He was not sure whether the mimic's life skill would be capable of fooling a device like this, but he had no other option. He placed his hand on the crystal ball. His name appeared as Nito. His class came up as healer, and the registration went through without any trouble. Nito felt the tension drain out of him. The skill had worked even against the guild's device, keeping his true identity and real stats completely hidden. Once the registration was done, Sierra asked Nito what he planned to do from here. Nito turned to Toa and brought up the idea of visiting the town hall, suggesting it might be a good place to start looking for information about where her hometown was. Toa looked away from him and said perhaps later, without much feeling behind the words. Nito noticed right away that she did not seem particularly eager to find her way back home. He then asked whether she wanted to register at the guild as an adventurer as well. Toa said that yes, she'd want to do that. Before anything else could happen, a man from inside the guild walked over and dropped his arm across Nito's shoulder in a way that was immediately unwelcome. The man made a remark about how lucky Nito was to have two women at his side and suggested that he share them with his group. Nito let out a short and slightly uncomfortable laugh and recognized the situation for what it was. He politely told the man that the two women were his friends, and that was all there was to it. The man's friendliness evaporated instantly and turned into open hostility. He raised his voice and told Nito to take his friends and go. He said that a healer had no business thinking he could survive as an adventurer and that someone like Nito should go back home where he belonged. He then introduced himself and his companions as C-rank adventurers and said in a mocking tone that they would be more than willing to look after Nito's friends on his behalf. Sierra told the man plainly that he was being rude. The man turned his attention to her instead, asking why she was wasting her time with someone like Nito when she could be spending it with him and his group instead. At that moment, a woman entered the guild and spotted Sierra immediately. She approached and bowed respectfully, greeting her with clear familiarity. She asked who the people with Sierra were. Sierra explained that she had met Nito and Toa by chance while making her way to the capital, had promised to guide them to the guild, and that was why they were all there together. The woman bowed to both Nito and Toa and thanked them warmly for having looked after Sierra during the journey. She then asked if it was time for them to return to the castle. The rude man, furious at being completely ignored while he was still speaking, grabbed Sierra by the collar and demanded that she stop acting as though he was not there. Sierra responded without hesitation. She took him and slammed him flat onto the floor, pinning him there, and asked in a very calm but very dangerous voice exactly who he thought he was putting his hands on. The entire guild went quiet and stared. Nito stood there watching and thought privately that if this man was considered C-rank, the bar for that ranking was lower than he had imagined. Before leaving with the woman from the castle, Sierra turned back to Toa one final time and asked if she was truly certain she did not want to visit the town hall. Toa confirmed that she was fine. Sierra told them both that if any problem came up while she was gone, they were welcome to come to the Ekarlat residence. She left Toa in Nito's care and headed off. Nito smiled and told her not to worry. Once outside the guild, Nito stood still for a moment and tried to figure out what his next move should be. The answer arrived quickly and was more than a little embarrassing. He had no money, not a single coin to his name. Without money, there was essentially nothing he could do. Before he could sit too long with that problem, someone nearby called out to them. A woman standing outside shop had noticed Nito and remarked that his clothing looked very unusual. She invited the two of them inside. The shop owner was genuinely surprised to learn that they were traveling with no money at all. She pointed out that people who went about the world that way usually ended up dead somewhere in the middle of nowhere before long. She also noticed that Nito's clothes were dirty and had clearly been through a great deal of wear. She offered to trade them for new ones and said she was happy to do the same for Toa as well. Nito pointed out that his clothes were in pretty poor shape, but the shop owner waved that aside. She told him that good fabric could be worked into almost anything with the right hands, and that the material his clothes were made from was of genuinely high quality. Throwing them away, she said, would be a real waste. Nito looked down at his old high school uniform and decided to accept her offer. The shop owner asked what his class was, assuming from his general appearance that he might be a warrior or perhaps a hunter. Nito told her he was a healer. She expressed honest sympathy, acknowledging that it was a difficult class to build a life around as an adventurer. She got to work, and after a short, while had prepared a proper robe for him along with a small pouch designed for carrying herbs. Nito asked whether healers actually needed to carry herbs around with them. The shop owner seemed genuinely surprised that he did not already know this. She explained that healers could only produce weak healing magic on their own, and that they needed to supplement this with as many physical healing items as possible in order to be of real use. She then asked about the young woman with him, meaning Toa, wanting to know what class she was. Nito realized in that moment that he had not actually looked at Toa's status for himself yet. Toa answered directly, telling the shop owner that she was a paladin. The woman's eyebrows shot up. She explained that paladins were also called magic knights, an exceptional and rare class that brought together two completely different sets of abilities, allowing the person to use both magic and swordsmanship together rather than being limited to one or the other. Toa then mentioned that she was from the demon race. The moment Nito heard this, his mind went back to something the king of Grey Belka had spoken of before about a long history of fighting against the demon race. Nito kept his expression easy and casual and asked the shop owner, as though the term meant nothing to him, what exactly the demon race was. The shop owner admitted that she did not know a great deal about them herself. What she did know was that they were said to live somewhere beyond a great forest that lay far outside the kingdom's borders, and that members of the demon race were always born with naturally high magical power as a fundamental part of who they were. She then looked between the two of them and asked with obvious curiosity what kind of relationship they were in, since it was quite a strange combination to come across. A little while later, Nito and Toa had both changed into their new clothes. The shop owner looked them over and told them they both looked good. She had also included an extra broadsword as part of the deal, tucking it in for Toa. Nito thanked her genuinely for everything she had done. The shop owner dismissed his thanks lightly, saying that what she had given them was nothing compared to what his clothes had been worth in trade. She also pressed a small gift into his hand as a token of goodwill, along with a piece of advice she clearly felt he needed to hear. She told him that while this particular country was generally accepting of the demon race, there were still plenty of people and places beyond its borders that were not. Beyond that, the naturally high magical power that demons carried made them easy targets for kidnappers and those who traded in people against their will. Someone like Toa, in particular, would draw that kind of unwanted attention without much difficulty. She told Nito plainly that if he was going to call himself a man, he had better make sure he protected her. Nito let her words settle over him and felt the quiet truth of them. Being too powerful brought fear and resentment from others. Being visibly different brought discrimination and danger. These things were not unique to the world he had come from. They were simply part of how the world worked, any world. He told the shop owner she could count on him to do right by Toa, and she smiled at them both warmly. Before they left, the shop owner introduced herself as Sharon and told them that her door was always open if they ever needed anything again. Nito and Toa found a spot nearby to sit down and get something to drink. Nito looked across at Toa and thought about how, without really planning for it, he had ended up traveling alongside someone who was not even human. He also thought about something that had been quietly nagging at him. Toa's level was clearly higher than anyone he had seen at the guild. The adventurers there had been sitting somewhere between level 10 and 17, with the highest among them being level 23. But there was something specific about Toa that had been sitting at the back of his mind, connected to the demon's Eye of Truth skill he carried. He decided to ask her directly. He wanted to know whether she was actually able to see his status. Toa said yes, she could. Nito asked what she made of it. Toa told him that beyond finding it completely abnormal, she had not thought much more about it than that. Nito absorbed this quietly. Even to a demon, his status looked like something that should not be possible. He then asked another question that had been sitting with him. He wanted to know why she had ended up captured by the thieves in the first place. Given how strong she clearly was, she should have been more than capable of dealing with them on her own. Toa looked away and gave a very plain and simple answer. She had been scared. Nito sat with that for a moment, trying to make sense of it. He thought back through what she had already told him. When she had first become aware of her surroundings, she had already been in the forest and was in the process of being taken away. He asked her where she had been before that moment. Toa told him she had been in a castle. Nito was surprised to hear it. His mind immediately began turning over the possibilities. Was she from a wealthy family? A noble household? Could she be a princess? The thoughts came quickly and piled on top of each other. He also found himself wondering whether the demon race even had a social structure with ranks and titles the way humans did. He asked her what she had actually been doing in the castle. Toa's answer was simple and unhurried. She said she had not been doing anything particularly important. Her mornings were spent training in magic and swordsmanship. Her evenings were spent waiting for her father, her mother, and her older sister to return home. While she waited, she would sometimes wander into the treasure room to pass the time, or go out into the garden and talk with the pixies that lived there. As she spoke, the picture of her life before all of this came together quietly and clearly. Totrika had not been permitted to go outside the castle walls from a very young age. She had never once stepped beyond them. The world that existed on the other side of those walls was something that frightened her deeply, both the openness of it and the people who lived in it. She had never been given the chance to grow familiar with any of it. And in that way, without either of them having said so out loud, she and Nito were more alike than their differences suggested. She was stepping into the outside world for the very first time, just as he was, and finding it just as overwhelming. Later that day, Toa and Nito went out and fought their way through a number of monsters and goblins. When it was done, Nito looked at what they had collected and figured it would be enough to cover the cost of staying in an inn for the night. As he picked up the goblin fangs from the ground, he noticed that the monsters had left behind actual physical remains rather than disappearing after being defeated. He had assumed that creatures in this world would vanish upon death the way they did in certain stories and games he had known, but that turned out not to be the case. Toa explained to him that monsters only vanished when defeated inside a dungeon. Out in the open world, they stayed as they were after dying. She also clarified something else he had not fully understood. There was a difference between monsters and what were called Momono. Momono were beings that possessed intelligence and were capable of speaking the human language, making them fundamentally different from ordinary monsters. Nito thought back and realized that the one-eyed bat he had encountered and defeated earlier, the creature called Zuri, had in fact been a Momono. They brought the goblin teeth to the receptionist counter inside the guild. The receptionist confirmed the count of 10 teeth and handed over a small amount of coins as their reward. Nito noticed Toa yawn beside him and suggested they find an inn to rest at as soon as possible. The receptionist, overhearing this, mentioned that the inn connected to the guild currently had a vacancy. They thanked her and were about to head that way. Before they could leave, a man nearby called out to Toa and asked for her name. Nito stepped in politely and explained that Toa was with him. The man looked at Nito and asked if he had seen him around before, and when Nito told him he had just started as an adventurer that day, the man understood that he was brand new. The man then asked if Nito had kicked off his career by going after goblins, which he said in a tone that made it clear he found this underwhelming. Nito thought privately that the man had clearly been listening in on a conversation that was not his to hear, but replied calmly that yes, being an adventurer was harder than it looked. The man seemed to brush past Nito entirely and said that low-rank missions like goblin extermination brought in very little money. Nito told him not to worry about them and that they were fine. The man made it clear that he was not actually speaking to Nito at all and told him plainly to stay out of the conversation. The man directed his words entirely at Toa from that point on. He told her that if she came with him instead, she would not be stuck hunting goblins. He claimed he could take on hunting wolves, giant snakes, and even creatures called grizzles without any trouble. He mentioned that he had witnessed the scene at noon when Nito had gotten into an argument with other adventurers, and he pointed out Nito's class as a healer, suggesting that Nito's journey as an adventurer had essentially ended before it had even properly begun. He said that Nito was probably going to be sleeping at the cheapest possible inn that night. He then placed his hand on Toa's shoulder and told her that if she came with him, he could give her far more than that and could satisfy her in ways that Nito could not. Nito took all of this in and thought to himself that this man's motives were obvious and not even remotely worth engaging with seriously. He called out to Toa, intending to simply leave, but Toa had already had enough. Without a word in response to the man, she raised her hand and electrocuted him with a lightning skill. The man dropped to the floor, and the adventurers around them stared in stunned disbelief. Nito grabbed Toa by the arm and led her quickly out of the guild before anything else could happen. Once they were outside, Nito asked her to stop for a moment. Toa turned and demanded to know why Nito had not said anything to the man. She pointed out that Nito was strong and that he could have pushed back. Nito told her that was exactly the reason he had not. Because he knew what he was truly capable of, he also knew that a man like that was not worth the trouble, and he preferred to avoid making a scene if there was another way. Toa raised her voice in frustration. She asked if he had not felt even a little angry at being spoken to like that. The man had openly mocked him, and that had been genuinely infuriating to her on his behalf. Nito stood there and absorbed what she had said. He admitted to himself that yes, he had been angry, but he also thought that being as openly reactive about it as Toa had been was not always the right approach. What struck him more deeply, though, was the fact that someone who had only known him for such a short time had gotten genuinely upset on his behalf. That meant something to him that he had not expected. He apologized to her. He acknowledged that revenge had briefly crossed his mind, but seeing Toa react the way she had made him pause. He thanked her for being angry for his sake. He promised that next time he would try harder to stand up for himself, but explained that as someone who was supposed to be a healer in the eyes of the world, it was better to resolve things without drawing too much attention whenever possible. Toa said she understood. As he walked alongside her, Nito thought quietly about the connections he had begun to form in this world without really planning to. He had come here focused entirely on revenge, but Toa had just reminded him, without meaning to, that there would be a life waiting for him on the other side of that goal. He realized he needed to start thinking differently, not just for his own sake, but for hers as well. It was also the first time in his life that he had truly understood what it felt like to have someone stand up for him. Night came, and they found a place to eat. Toa looked at the food in front of her with genuine delight, saying the meat was incredibly delicious. Nito assumed this was probably nothing new for her, given where she had come from. But Toa surprised him by saying that she had not actually eaten like this before. When Nito asked what she had eaten back in the castle, Toa told him that she had simply eaten whatever was prepared for her each day. Her mother had chosen food that was supposed to strengthen magical power, and that was what she had always been given. Nito looked at her as she ate and felt his curiosity about her deepen. The more he learned, the more questions he had. He made a mental note that at some point he would need to look into the land of the demons, because that was likely where Toa's home was. He also thought that the food she was eating now would almost certainly do more for her strength than what she had been given back in the castle. Toa seemed to agree, saying with sincerity that she thought she could work very hard if it meant getting to eat food like this. Nito smiled at that, and told her he was glad it made her happy. He then asked her whether she wanted to take another quest the following day, ideally one that came with a bigger reward than what they had earned that evening. Toa said she was happy with whatever he decided. Later, back at the inn, Nito remarked that they had been lucky to get a room at a place that was so popular. He told Toa that he would sleep on the floor and that she should take the bed. Toa pushed back on this immediately, suggesting that he simply sleep on the other side of the bed instead. She called him over, telling him he would catch a cold sleeping on the floor. Nito resisted, saying that he moved around a lot in his sleep and did not want to be a bother. Toa dismissed this concern entirely and told him plainly that she trusted Masamune, using his real name as she said it. Nito asked what exactly she meant by that. Toa simply looked at him and asked if he was going to sleep or not. Nito said he would and lay down on the bed, his nerves very much present. In the middle of the night, Nito was still lying there awake and unable to sleep. Toa's voice broke the quiet. She asked if he was still awake. He told her he was. She then began to speak about her life in the castle. She said she had always been alone there. Her father and mother came home only at night, and her older sister rarely came home at all. The only company she had was the pixies she talked to in the garden. Every day had been lonely, she said. But now, she told him quietly she did not feel lonely anymore. She was with Masamune. She said good night, and not long after, both of them drifted off to sleep. Morning came. There was a knock at the door of Nito's room. It was Sierra, who greeted him brightly when he opened the door, still half asleep. Nito asked groggily what had brought her there so early in the morning. Sierra pointed out that it was nearly noon. She told him she had come because she had been thinking of starting his swordsmanship lessons that day. Nito agreed and took that in. At that moment, Toa stirred and woke up, asking what was going on. Nito began to explain that Sierra had come to teach him, but before he could finish, Toa stood up. Both Nito and Sierra went rigid in shock. Nito asked Toa in a flustered voice why she was dressed the way she was. Sierra immediately jumped to a very specific conclusion about the situation. The three of them ended up tangled in a brief but awkward misunderstanding. A little while later, before they sat down to eat breakfast, Sierra apologized for the way she had reacted. She admitted that she had jumped to a conclusion without thinking. Toa, still not entirely pleased, muttered about what kind of nights this country produced, given how quickly Sierra had gone physical. Nito told Toa it was already settled and that it had not actually hurt regardless of how many times he had been hit. Sierra looked at him with surprise and asked what he meant by saying it had not hurt. Nito told her not to worry about it. Sierra then brought up something she had noticed. She mentioned that she had heard Toa call him Masamune rather than Nito. Nito explained the situation, making it clear that Nito was the name he used publicly and that Masamune was his real name, something he asked Sierra to keep between them. Sierra said she understood and would respect that. As he looked at Toa, Nito realized she had let his real name slip in front of someone else without thinking. He reminded himself that he should have been clearer with her about being careful. Sierra, however, was more curious than anything. She said the name Masamune was not one she had heard before, and asked whether it was a name from a place called Jikoku. Nito said it was not exactly that, but Sierra went on to mention that Jikoku was said to be a country that could be found across the sea from the Vanom continent, and that the people who lived there reportedly looked similar to Nito. Nito quietly filed this away, thinking that Jikoku was now somewhere he would need to look into as well. Sierra then asked what the two of them had planned for the day. She offered to teach Nito swordsmanship if they did not have anything else on their schedule. Nito told her that he was actually thinking of taking a quest from the guild, partly because he genuinely needed more money. Sierra nodded and then asked whether she could come along with him. Nito was surprised by the offer. Sierra explained that she would be useful and that having her along would make it possible to take on quests with much larger rewards attached to them. Nito thought about it and told her that of course she was welcome to join them. The adventurer ranking system in this world was organized by grade based on a person's achievements and track record. The lowest possible grade was F, and the highest anyone could reach was SSS. At their current standing, Nito and Toa were only permitted to take on requests up to grade E. However, because Sierra was accompanying them and held an A-grade ranking, they were now eligible to take on grade D requests or higher than they normally would have been able to access on their own. Nito had not realized that Sierra was also registered as an adventurer. He had only known her as a knight and was surprised to learn otherwise. Sierra explained that before she had entered the service of the country, she had taken requests from the guild just like any other adventurer. She also added that knights in this particular country were required to register as adventurers regardless, meaning that every knight in the kingdom was also an adventurer by default. Nito then asked whether it was really alright for her to be showing up at the guild 2 days in a row, and also whether the White King's knights were not supposed to avoid being seen publicly. Sierra told him she would be fine, explaining that not many people actually knew the identities of the White King's knights. She was coming to the guild not in her capacity as a knight, but simply as an adventurer. The three of them stood in front of the request board and looked over what was available. Toa said she was happy with whatever Nito chose. Nito scanned the board carefully, though he quickly realized that he could not actually read the words written on most of the requests. Even the goblin extermination job they had done the day before had been set up for them by the receptionist directly. He pointed to one particular request and asked what it was. Sierra told him it was a Kalane, describing it as a large beast with 2 horns that made its home deep in the forest. Nito decided that was the one they should take. After they had completed the necessary procedures at the reception counter, Sierra asked if they could make a quick stop at the shop across the street before heading out. Nito agreed without hesitation. When they stepped inside, the shop owner greeted Sierra warmly and asked whether she had a day off. Sierra explained that they were about to head into the forest to deal with a Kalane and that she wanted to stock up on medicine before they left. Nito noticed some small bottles on the shelves and asked what they were. Sierra told him they were medicine that protected a person's hearing. The Kalane was known for producing a voice that could paralyze anyone who heard it, making the medicine an essential thing to have before going anywhere near one. While they were still in the shop, the owner returned from the back and immediately recognized Nito and Toa from the day before. She looked at them both closely and asked whether they were the healer boy and the paladin girl she had spoken with previously. Sierra's eyebrows shot up at the word paladin. The shop owner immediately caught herself, remembering that she had been the one to tell them in the first place not to go around sharing information about their classes with people. Later, as the three of them walked through Grill Forest on their way to find a Kalane, Sierra was still visibly struggling to accept what she had just learned. Nito asked her with some exasperation whether she was still on the subject. Sierra said she could not help it. She explained that in the entire country, there was only one person known to have the Paladin class. It was an extraordinarily rare class, rare even among the ranks of the White King's knights themselves. The idea that Toa, someone they had only just met, also possessed that class was genuinely staggering to her. She said that if word of this got out, everyone who heard it would be shocked. Nito asked whether it had been a good idea for Sierra to be saying all of this out loud in the middle of the forest. Sierra brushed it off and said it would be fine before moving them along. Nito, walking behind her, quietly thought to himself that telling Sierra his real name had probably been a mistake. As they continued through the trees, they came across a group of adventurers who were clearly in bad shape. They were injured and moving quickly in the direction away from deeper in the forest. Sierra asked them what had happened and whether they were all right. One of the men began to explain, his voice noticeably unsteady as he spoke. He said they had come into the forest to hunt orcs, and that things had seemed normal at first. Then, without any warning, something had shifted. Not just the goblins, but the orcs and the hunting wolves had all begun to flee at once, running away in a panic. He said that should have been a sign for them to turn back to. Then they had encountered it, a Kalane. But when they had seen it, something about it was wrong. It had not looked like any Kalane they had ever come across. Its entire body had been giving off light. Another injured adventurer stepped in and confirmed this, saying that he had seen Kalanes before and knew what they were supposed to look like. Whatever they had just faced had not been a normal one. Sierra's expression shifted immediately. She asked if the creature had looked like it was covered in small grains of light. The adventurer said yes, that was exactly what it had been like. Sierra's face went tight with worry. Before anyone could say another word, a massive roar tore through the forest. Every bird in the surrounding trees launched itself into the air at once. The injured adventurers said that was the creature they had been describing. It had been following them. A moment later, the beast emerged into view in the middle of the forest. Its body glowed with light, just as the adventurers had described. Sierra turned to the injured group and told them firmly to get out of the area while she and her companions dealt with it. The creature roared again, and the sound rolled through the trees. Nito stood and looked at the monster in front of him. A small smile crossed his face as he said it out loud. This was the Kalane. Sierra immediately told him that no, it was not. What they were looking at was something called a Nut Kalane, and she was visibly shaken as she said it. She reminded him of the grading system she had explained at the guild. Just as adventurers were ranked by grade, monsters were ranked in the same way. A standard Kalane was a grade B monster, and defeating one was classified as a grade A request, largely because of how ferocious they were and because of the wide reach of their paralyzing voice. But a Nut Kalane was something else entirely. It was classified as a genuine grade A monster, one that fell under the category of a particularly dangerous request. The difference in threat level between a regular Kalane and a Nut Kalane was significant. Sierra turned to Nito and Toa and asked if they were both alright. Nito said he was perfectly fine. Toa said she felt okay as well. Sierra said she was genuinely impressed by that, because for her own part, having been struck by the creature's voice had already caused her mana circulation to become unstable. She looked at Nito, thinking quietly about what she had briefly witnessed him do back at the thieves' camp, the movement she had only caught a glimpse of. She asked him directly that if things went wrong during the fight, could she leave it to him to handle. Nito quickly checked the monster's status using his devil eye. It was a level 32 Nut Kalane. He looked at the number and decided it was not going to be a problem. He told Sierra to leave it to him and then turned to Toa. letting her know he was counting on her. Both of them acknowledged him and got ready. Sierra moved first. Using a skill called Ice Flash, she launched herself toward the monster at high speed, ice greatsword in hand. As she closed in, she was already wondering whether the creature had some form of immunity to physical weapons and wanted to test it directly. She brought her sword across the monster in a clean slash. It had no effect whatsoever. The monster retaliated immediately, swiping at her with its claws, and Sierra threw herself out of the way just in time to avoid the hit. Toa moved in to support her. She unleashed a lightning skill directly at the monster's head. That too had no effect. Toa stood there in visible shock. Magic was not working on it either. Sierra recalled something she had heard about Noot-Kalanes. She explained that they were known to control magic particles using their antlers. And looking at the creature now, it was clear that magic particles were swirling around its body in a dense layer. She decided that the antlers needed to be destroyed first before anything else could work against it. The monster then began charging up an attack of its own. Nito shouted a warning for everyone to get clear. The creature released a beam of light that tore through the trees around them, obliterating several in an instant. Sierra narrowly avoided being caught in the blast and looked genuinely shaken by how close it had come. Toa regrouped and summoned a magic circle, preparing to strike again. Sierra watched with surprise as Toa activated not one, but two magic circles simultaneously, a level of magical control that was far from ordinary. Toa then cast a skill called Light Howl directly at the monster. It still had no effect. Toa said out loud what they were all beginning to feel, that no matter what they threw at it, they could not damage it. Nito stood back and watched the battle carefully, thinking through what he was seeing. He considered that this might not be a situation where simply hitting harder would solve anything. If the creature was controlling magic particles, then its attacks were fundamentally magical in nature. That kind of invulnerability likely had a specific weakness built into it, some kind of trick or gap that needed to be exploited rather than overpowered. He thought of his soul break skill and began to wonder whether it might be the answer. He then noticed something else. At the exact moment the creature had fired that beam of light, the layer of glowing particles surrounding its body had briefly thinned and partially disappeared. That was the opening. If they could time their attack to land in that precise window, they might be able to get through. Sierra heard him thinking through this and asked what would happen if he got hit while trying to position himself for such a risky moment. Nito told her his plan. On the next time the monster charged up to fire, she should use him as a decoy to draw its attention. He told her he would be fine and that he would finish it quickly. Sierra was not sure what to make of his confidence, but she did not argue. Masamune let his power build and released his soul break skill directly at the monster. The attack struck the creature's antlers and shattered them. The Noot-Kalanes let out a howl of pain as the antlers broke apart. Sierra stood there completely baffled, unable to understand what had just happened or how he had done it. Masamune told her simply that he had broken its antlers, and added that he did not think the monster would be able to block their attacks anymore. But before anyone moved to finish the fight, Masamune said there was something he wanted to try on his own. He asked Sierra if she would be willing to step back and let him handle the monster from this point. Sierra said she did not mind, though she was clearly at a loss for words. She did manage to say thank you before he moved. Before he went forward, Masamune turned back to Sierra and made one quiet request. He asked her to please keep everything she had seen today to herself. Meanwhile, in an entirely different location, at the building that served as the base of the White King's Knights, a report had just come in. Someone had discovered a Kalane surrounded by particles of light in Grill Forest. The knight who received the report was immediately alarmed by the detail about the particles of light. He asked who had brought the information. The knight on duty explained that it had been reported by 4 adventurers who had encountered the creature and were now injured and receiving treatment at a hospital. According to what they had said when they gave their account, there were still 3 adventurers currently in the forest fighting the monster. The group was described as 1 man and 2 women, and one of the women had silver hair and was carrying a rapier. The man who had received this information did not hesitate. He was Reinhardt Rickman, the leader of the White King's Knights, and he immediately gave the order to notify 2 specific people named Raid and Hilda. He told them with full certainty that Sierra was out there in Grill Forest, fighting a Noot-Kalanes. 2 days earlier, when everyone in Tanya Village had gone to sleep and the night was quiet, Masamune had slipped away to check something. He went to look at Oliver's status screen now that the man was dead and no longer a threat. What he found told him that Oliver had been a fire magic user. Even if Masamune were to obtain elemental magic from him, he already understood that he would not be able to use it in the way a normal person could, given the nature of his abilities. As he was reading through Oliver's stats, something unexpected appeared on his screen. It looked like a kind of quest announcement, and Masamune was surprised to see it. He read through the contents carefully. What the message described was mostly about Oliver's wife, a woman named Anna. Oliver had originally become a knight because of her, and had driven himself to rise all the way to the position of leader. But when he returned from battle one day, he discovered that his wife had turned to thieving at some point while he was gone, and that she had been killed while in the act of stealing. The grief of losing her that way had broken Oliver completely, and the men under his command had mocked him in his lowest moment rather than showing him any understanding or compassion. Masamune turned all of this over in his mind. The message seemed to be connected in some way to a plot involving the assassination of the king. He found himself wondering what had pushed Oliver to the point of accepting such an order, but the message alone did not give him enough to fully piece it together. There were too many gaps. Then, without warning, a new notification appeared. He had acquired a magic spell called Hellfire. Masamune stared at it in surprise, genuinely taken aback that it was possible to learn magic in this particular way. He looked at the description. It was not a spell he recognized at all, and he suspected it might fall into the same category as elemental magic, meaning it would be something he could not actually use in its original form. The description told him that Hellfire was a fire born from Oliver Joe's deep and lasting grudge, one that would gradually burn its target over time. Masamune looked up at the night sky above him and let out a slow sigh. He muttered quietly to himself that he really hated being a healer. Then a thought came to him. He wondered whether the mischievous reversal might be able to do something with it. If fire was the nature of the spell, then reversing it might produce something connected to water. It seemed worth trying. He activated the god of revenge's mischief and applied the mischievous reversal to the spell. Hellfire shifted and transformed into something entirely new. The spell was now called Goddess Bloody Tears. Back in the present, the Noot Kalain was still writhing in pain from the damage Masamune had dealt to its antlers moments before. Masamune stood and looked down at his own hand. Something felt different. There was a sensation running through him that he could not quite identify, as though he was not entirely his usual self in that moment. Then something happened above them that none of them had any way to prepare for. It was as though the space in the sky directly above the monster had cracked open. Through the crack, an enormous figure appeared. She looked like a goddess, vast and impossible, looking down at the creature below her with an expression that carried a weight beyond anything ordinary. Toa and Sierra both stood completely still, too shocked to move or speak. The goddess above the monster let a single tear fall from her eye. The tear was red, bloody, and when it made contact with the Noot Kalain's body, it did not simply hit the surface. It passed through, leaving a hole in the creature's flesh. Then another tear fell, and another. Each drop that landed tore a new hole through the monster's body, one after another, covering it in wounds. The creature screamed in a way that shook the air around them. Its body began to slowly dissolve and evaporate wherever the tears had struck, breaking apart from the damage until there was almost nothing left of it. Sierra stood there unable to form a single coherent thought. She had no framework for what she had just witnessed and no way to explain it. Toa turned to Masamune and asked quietly whether it was over. Masamune said he thought it was. He also noticed that the strange feeling he had felt in himself just before the spell activated had disappeared completely, as though it had passed through him and left with the magic. Then they heard something in the distance. The sound of horses approaching, moving quickly in their direction. Masamune immediately told the group that they needed to leave before whoever was coming got close enough to see them. Toa agreed without argument. Masamune turned to Sierra and asked if he could leave everything from this point forward in her hands. He did not want to be found here. Sierra asked whether he meant just what had happened with the monster. Masamune told her he meant everything, all of it, every single thing she had seen that day. He told her directly that the reason he had allowed her to witness any of it was because he trusted her. He also made it clear that how she chose to handle the situation from here was entirely up to her. He told her to meet them back at the capital and said he would leave word with the innkeeper about where they would be. Then Masamune and Toa were gone, disappearing into the trees before the approaching riders could get any closer. Sierra was left standing alone in the middle of the destroyed forest. She stood there quietly for a moment, looking at the space where Masamune had just been, and asked herself in the silence of her own thoughts who exactly he was. The group of riders arrived not long after. Reinhardt and his people came through on horseback, following the information they had received about the location of the Noot Kalain. One of the men with him, named Raid, expressed loud excitement as he arrived, saying it had been a long time since he had had a real fight worth having, and that he intended to get to work with his scythe before anything happened to Sierra. He directed the remark toward the woman beside him, Hilda, who was clearly more concerned than excited. Unlike Raid, Hilda's thoughts were fixed on her younger sister Sierra and whether she was safe. As the group moved through the area, Reinhardt suddenly felt something. It was faint and brief, like the trace of an extremely fast movement somewhere very close to them. Raid asked him what was wrong. Reinhardt scanned the surroundings carefully before deciding that it was probably nothing and letting it go. A moment later, the group came to a stop. The trees around them had been shattered and thrown aside on a massive scale. The destruction stretched across a wide area. Raid looked around in disbelief and asked out loud what had happened, pointing out that there was supposed to be a Noot Kalain somewhere in this location. Reinhardt looked at what remained on the ground nearby. The remains were barely recognizable, broken down, and barely holding a shape. After a moment of studying it, he concluded that what they were looking at was, or rather had been, the Noot Kalain. Raid looked at the destroyed remains of the Noot Kalain and said out loud that no one would believe what they were seeing. Reinhardt replied that at the moment, they had no other leads to work with beyond what was in front of them. They turned their attention to Sierra, who was still standing nearby. Reinhardt asked her what had happened. The expression on Sierra's face was one of visible shock and distress. Reinhardt looked at her carefully and asked whether she was the one who had done this. Hilda immediately stepped forward and called out to her younger sister, and Sierra appeared genuinely startled to find Hilda standing right beside her. Reinhardt studied Sierra for a moment, and then mentioned that according to the information they had received, there were supposed to have been 2 other adventurers present at the location alongside her. Sierra told him simply that they were no longer there. Reinhardt was puzzled by this and pressed her to explain what she meant. He also pointed out that defeating a Noot Kalain would typically require at least 4 White King's Knights working together, and that he did not believe she could have managed it alone. Sierra looked back at him without offering anything further, and Reinhardt, reading her expression, silently accepted that she was not going to say more about it. Raid broke the tension by laughing and suggesting loudly that the other 2 adventurers must have been eaten by the Noot Kalain during the fight. He looked at Sierra's clearly shaken state and said that given how she looked right now, that explanation made the most sense. Hilda snapped at Raid and told him to stop talking. He let out a short laugh in response. Reinhardt sighed quietly. He told the group to contact the knight's office and begin collecting whatever could be gathered from the surrounding area. Later, at the palace, Reinhardt gave his report to the king. He explained the situation as best he could, saying that based on what he had observed, it appeared that Sierra had defeated the monster, but that her visibly unstable condition made it difficult to say anything with full certainty just yet. He recommended that they wait for further information before drawing any firm conclusions. The king of Razhausen, Arnold Razhausen, said he understood and told Reinhardt he would leave the matter in his hands. Reinhardt bowed and left the king's chamber. In the corridor outside, one of the other White King's knights, a man named Daniel, caught up with Reinhardt and fell in a step beside him. As they walked, Daniel asked whether it was true that what had been found in the forest was a Noot Kalain. Reinhardt said the investigation was still ongoing. Daniel then asked who had been responsible for defeating it. Reinhardt gave the same answer, still being looked into. Daniel expressed his disbelief and pushed Reinhardt to share even a small detail. Reinhardt told him honestly that even now, he himself was still in the dark about the full picture. He suggested that if Daniel wanted answers, he should go and ask Sierra directly, since she had been there. He also mentioned that the Kalain's remains were with the autopsy team, and that Daniel would find out everything he needed to know if he simply waited. Daniel looked at Reinhardt for a moment and then smirked. Reinhardt asked what that expression was about. Daniel said that he had known Reinhardt for a long time and that he could tell when something unusual was going on. He asked outright whether there was something about this situation that did not add up. Reinhardt gave no visible reaction. He told Daniel what the information had stated, that there were 3 adventurers in the battle, one of whom was Sierra, and that the other 2 were nowhere to be found when Reinhardt's group had arrived. He also mentioned that the state of the Noot Kalain's corpse when they found it had been so severely damaged that it had barely been recognizable as the creature it once was. Daniel took all of this in and said that the answers to everything were clearly in the hands of those 2 missing adventurers. Reinhardt said that was probably the case. He also added that Sierra clearly knew what had happened out there, but for whatever reason, she was choosing not to say anything about it, and he was not going to pressure her into speaking if she did not want to. Daniel suggested that someone could interrogate her. Reinhardt said he had no interest in forcing out information that Sierra was deliberately choosing to keep to herself. Daniel then reasoned that if those 2 adventurers had truly been the ones to kill a Noot Kalain, then they were not ordinary people. He suggested they might be as strong as the White King's Knights themselves. Reinhardt responded quietly that they might even be stronger. Daniel laughed at that and dismissed it as impossible, asking whether Reinhardt was seriously suggesting that someone out there was stronger than him. Reinhardt said he was not sure yet. He turned the situation over in his thoughts. If those 2 ever caused trouble for the country, Sierra, as someone who had been with them and was now effectively shielding them with her silence, would need to be prepared to face the consequences of that. But for now, Reinhardt told Daniel there was only one thing he needed to know about those 2 people. He needed to know whether they were enemies or allies. That was all that mattered to him at this point. Meanwhile, in another part of the town, Masamune and Toa had found a place to sit and rest. Toa brought up the mischievous reversal skill and what it had done during the fight, noting that as a healer, Masamune should not have been capable of using elemental magic at all. Masamune agreed and said that going forward, it would probably be better for him to seal that particular magic away. He pointed out that even without it, he had been able to break the Noot Kalain's horns with his bare hands without any difficulty. Toa reached out and held his hand gently. She smiled at him and told him that if he did not want to use his powers, she would do everything she could to protect him in his place. Masamune was genuinely surprised by this and thanked her warmly. He then told her that there was something he had been meaning to ask her for a while. He wanted to know why she had trusted him so quickly when they had first met, given how little she had known about him at the time. But before Toa could answer, Sierra appeared and called out to them from nearby. Masamune smiled at Sierra and told her to save her answer for next time, directing the words to Toa. Sierra asked whether she had interrupted something. Masamune told her not to worry about it and apologized for making her come all the way to find them. Sierra got straight to the point. She told Masamune that for the time being, it was important that he not draw any attention to himself. She explained that the Noot Kalain had been taken by the White King's Knights, and that she had not said anything about either of the 2 of them during the process. He did not need to worry for now, but she could not make any guarantees about what might come out later. Masamune thanked her. He scratched the back of his head and noted that it seemed like they were not going to be able to collect their reward after all. The quest had originally been for subduing a Kalane, and the way things had gone made claiming it impossible. Sierra told him plainly that it was better that way. If he went to collect the reward, there was a real chance it would lead to him being discovered, and avoiding that was more important than money. Before any of them could say anything more, someone came toward them with an energy that immediately demanded attention. The man was Raid, and he was clearly in high spirits about something. Sierra was visibly startled to see him there and asked why he had come. Raid launched into an excited description of what he had seen in the forest, saying that whatever had done it had turned the Noot Kalane into what could only be described as minced meat, and that he knew with absolute certainty that no power he himself possessed could have produced that result. He looked between the people in front of him with a wide grin and demanded to know which one of them had taken his prey. Raid explained what had happened from his perspective. When the injured adventurers had reported the situation to the soldiers at the gate, the White King's knights had rushed to the forest immediately. But by the time Raid and the others had arrived, the Noot Kalane's horn had already been snapped clean off. The monster itself had been reduced to a bloody, unrecognizable mess, with a pool of blood spread around it on the ground. Raid knew that the standard way to kill a Noot Kalane, given that it was immune to magic, was through sustained physical attacks. But what had been done to this one was clearly the work of magic, not physical force. He pointed out that breaking a Noot Kalane's horn under normal circumstances was essentially impossible, because the material was extraordinarily tough and resilient. None of it made any sense to him, no matter how he looked at it. The manner of killing, the scale of the damage, the destruction of the horn, all of it defied what he knew to be possible. He said that being able to kill a sacred beast, as though it were an ordinary monster, was something he simply could not ignore or let pass without answers. Masamune looked at Raid and summed up what he was hearing. He pointed out that, in short, Raid had suspected Sierra from the beginning and had been following her to get to the bottom of it. Raid confirmed this without hesitation and said there was no other explanation that made sense. Without any further warning, Raid suddenly launched himself at them in an attack. Sierra cried out that Masamune and Toa were her close friends and that they were not enemies. Raid told her flatly that it was not her decision to make. He would decide that for himself. He attacked without hesitation. At the White King's Knights building, Reinhardt felt the sudden surge of Raid's magic power from distance. He understood immediately that something was happening and moved. Back at the site of the attack, Toa stepped forward and put herself between Raid and both Masamune and Sierra, managing to parry his strike at the very last moment. Raid was visibly surprised that she had blocked it. He asked for her name. Toa introduced herself as Totrika and told him plainly that she was the one who had killed the Noot Kalane. Raid was caught off guard by this and then broke into a laugh, saying he had not expected it to have been a woman. He turned his gaze toward Masamune and thought to himself that he could not sense any magical power from a man whatsoever. By contrast, the magical presence he felt from Toa was enormous and unmistakable. He immediately turned his full attention toward her and raised his scythe. Raid attacked Toa relentlessly, swinging his scythe at her in a continuous series of strikes. Toa told Masamune and Sierra to move back and give her space. Raid closed the gap between them in an instant and whispered to her, asking whether she had time to be looking away, as he swung his long scythe with full force. Toa blocked the strike and immediately countered. Raid leaped back to avoid her counterattack and landed at a distance, looking at her with clear interest. He acknowledged that she was impressive, exactly what he would expect from someone capable of killing a Noot Kalane. However, he said, the fight was going nowhere at this pace. He announced that he was going to use one of his trump cards. He activated Fire Armor, wrapping himself in flames. Sierra was visibly shocked to see him bringing out his magic. Raid declared the second round had begun and charged at Toa again, his scythe now blazing with fire. He told her not to think it would go the same way as before. Toa did her best to hold her ground and block his attacks, but the additional force of the fire-enhanced weapon was clearly making it harder to manage. Masamune called out to her in concern. Toa told him she was all right and kept fighting. Raid kept pressing, slashing repeatedly and telling her that she would not be able to stop his scythe. He demanded that she stop holding back and use her magic, wanting to see her true power. Toa told him that she was already fighting at her full capacity. Raid responded by kicking her sharply and then drawing back to deliver what he intended to be the finishing blow. He swung his scythe with everything he had, the full weight of his magic behind it. Before the strike could connect, Reinhardt arrived. He stepped into the space between them and caught both of their weapons simultaneously, stopping the attack with his bare hands. Everyone present froze in shock. Raid demanded to know what Reinhardt thought he was doing by interfering. Reinhardt looked at him steadily and told him that those words could just as easily apply to Raid himself, and asked what exactly he thought he was doing. Raid backed down and stopped attacking. Masamune immediately moved to Toa and cast a healing spell on her. He checked her injuries and was relieved to find that the wounds would not leave any permanent scars. Toa thanked him quietly. Masamune then asked her why she had not used her magic during the fight. He said he was certain she would not have fallen behind Raid if she had. Toa explained that if she had used it, the The resulting force would have destroyed everything around them. She had held back deliberately to avoid that. Raid turned to Reinhardt and told him that the woman was the one who had killed the Noot Kalain. Reinhardt looked back at him calmly and simply asked what of it. Raid was genuinely taken aback by the flat response. Reinhardt told him that the fact she had killed the monster did not make her an enemy. She had been carrying out a request to exterminate a monster, and that was all. Raid pushed back, asking why she had run from the scene if it was as straightforward as that. Reinhardt did not engage further with the argument. Raid then shifted his attention to Masamune and asked whether he had just used healing magic. He asked if Masamune was a priest. Masamune told him he was a healer. Raid was surprised by this for a moment, and then his surprise quickly turned into mockery. He said that it made perfect sense that he could not sense any power from him, and called Masamune a trashy healer, laughing at the idea. He continued to ridicule him, and then turned to Toa, telling her that she had ended up with completely useless trash as a partner. Masamune stood there and thought to himself that Raid was exactly like Siki. Then Reinhardt spoke up, directing a sharp question at Raid. He asked him to repeat what he had just said, that he could not sense anything from Masamune. Reinhardt turned and looked at Masamune directly, and in that moment his expression changed completely. Something in what he saw stopped him cold. He could not believe it. Before Reinhardt could say anything further, Raid cut him off and told him that if he was not going to do anything, he should stay out of it. Raid declared that he did not care about the question of whether someone was an enemy or not. His view was simple. When he encountered someone powerful, it was better to eliminate them before they had a chance to grow even stronger. He shouted that it was what was best for the country and raised his scythe to attack again. Reinhardt called out for him to stop. But before he could finish the sentence, a loud explosion erupted directly in front of everyone. When the dust and debris cleared, Reinhardt saw Masamune standing in the center of the blast, completely unaffected. Raid was on the ground, unconscious. Reinhardt understood immediately. He drew his sword into a defensive position, his mind now working through what he had just witnessed. He realized that Masamune was the one who had actually killed the Noot Kalain. Sierra called out to Reinhardt and told him that Masamune was not an enemy. Reinhardt looked at them again, and another thing struck him. He asked out loud how they had gotten so far away in that instant. Masamune had moved both Toa and Sierra to a safe distance and dealt with Raid all within the same split second, without anyone being able to track the movement. Sierra told Reinhardt to lower his sword and explained that Masamune had only acted to protect Toa. Reinhardt looked down and realized he had drawn his sword on pure instinct without consciously deciding to. He sheathed it immediately and apologized, saying he had been caught off guard. Masamune asked him directly whether he had realized from the beginning that he was the one responsible for the Noot Kalain. Reinhardt explained his reasoning. Raid had said he could not sense anything from Masamune, and that alone was impossible under normal circumstances. Every living person was born with some degree of magical power, even if it was very small, and it was always possible to sense at least a trace of it from anyone. There was only one exception to that rule, and it was when a person's magical power so vastly exceeded the observer's own that it became impossible to detect at all. In short, Reinhardt told Masamune that the magical power he carried was so far beyond what either he or Raid could measure that it registered as nothing. Reinhardt then apologized for failing to stop Raid before things had gone as far as they did, and said he would take full responsibility for what had happened. Masamune told him to forget about it. He said plainly that all they wanted was to avoid drawing attention. They wanted to take ordinary requests, complete them, and collect their rewards like any normal adventurer would. Reinhardt told him that he would personally ensure they received proper compensation for the defeat of the Noot Kalain, and that he would not tell anyone about what had really happened. He did acknowledge, however, that he still needed to file a report for the king. He proposed to frame it in the report as though Masamune and Toa had simply been assisting Sierra in the fight, and suggested they leave at that. Masamune looked at him and decided quietly that this was a person he could trust. Reinhardt picked up the unconscious Raid and told them they would be leaving. Before going, he asked for Masamune's name and apologized one more time for all the trouble. He told Masamune that he hoped they would meet again someday, and then he was gone. After Reinhardt left, Masamune stood there and reflected on what had just happened. He thought about how Toa had held herself back throughout the entire fight, and how he had gone and made a mess of everything despite that. He had not imagined that a single punch could cause that much damage and commotion. Later, at the palace, Daniel was in conversation with Reinhardt, and made a remark about hoping there would not be a repair bill headed their way, given the state of things. He then told Reinhardt that the reports coming in about the Noot Kalain were adding up quickly. Reinhardt asked if Daniel had been able to make any sense of it all. Daniel said yes, though what he had found was deeply strange. He explained that when they had recovered the body of the Noot Kalain, it had barely resembled the creature it had once been. It had taken a considerable amount of time for the autopsy team to reconstruct enough of its original form to work with. But what they had discovered during that process was deeply unsettling. The creature was hollow inside. When the team had examined it more closely, they found that it was far thinner than a normal Noot Kalain should be. There were no internal organs inside it all. Daniel said this in a serious tone, and then stated the conclusion that the autopsy team had reached. The Noot Kalain had already been dead before any of them had encountered it. Reinhardt was struck by this. Daniel continued, saying that this meant someone had been operating behind the scenes and manipulating the creature. He added that sacred beasts were mutated monsters, and that he had never once heard of anyone being able to control or manipulate one. Whatever was being attempted, Daniel did not think this incident would be the end of it. He said the forest needed to be investigated as soon as possible. Reinhardt agreed without hesitation. He told Daniel that he would give him full authority over the investigation team and asked him to take charge of the matter. Daniel accepted without question. Reinhardt stood quietly for a moment after that, a heavy feeling settling over him. Something unknown and potentially very dangerous was moving toward this country, and whatever it was, it had not yet fully shown itself. Sierra, knowing that Masamune and Toa had no money to their names, invited them to the Ekarlat residence. When they arrived, a feast had been prepared and laid out for them. Masamune looked around at the household and admitted to himself that he had not expected Sierra to turn out to be the daughter of a noble family. Sierra responded immediately and firmly, saying she was simply a knight and nothing more, and asked him not to refer to her with any title suggesting otherwise. The first person Masamune found himself meeting was Sierra's father, a man named Braun Ekarlat. Braun told him that Sierra had spoken a great deal about Masamune the evening before, and that after hearing her accounts, he had wanted to meet the person she had been describing in person. Sierra's mother, Maria, chimed in as well, saying that Sierra had mentioned Masamune was quite strong and asking whether that was really true. She also said she had heard the story about what had happened in Tanya village when he had saved a young boy. Masamune glanced over at Sierra as her mother spoke, and Sierra immediately looked away in another direction. Masamune thought to himself that she might have something of a tendency to talk more than she realized. Before much more could be said, the door opened. Maria welcomed the new arrival warmly and introduced her to Masamune and Toa as Sierra's friends. The woman who had entered was Hilda, Sierra's older sister and fellow White King's knight. She smiled at them and greeted them pleasantly. Masamune found himself genuinely struck by how beautiful she was. Toa, standing beside him, shot him a sharp look, and the expression on her face made it clear she was not pleased by his reaction. During the meal, Hilda mentioned that she had heard Masamune had helped Sierra in Tanya village, and that apparently that very day she had also been in his care in some capacity. Masamune looked at Hilda carefully as she said this, wondering whether she was referring to the incident with the Nook Kalain. He could not understand how she would have known about that, but then it came back to him. He remembered that Hilda had been part of the group that had arrived at the forest with Reinhardt. That meant she had been there. Sierra stepped in before Masamune could follow that thread any further and told him that her sister Hilda held the same position as herself, also being one of the White King's knights. Masamune absorbed this and thought about what it meant. If that was the case, then it was not just the Ekarlat household that was aware of his secret. It was entirely possible that all of the White King's knights knew something about him at this point. He commented that having two siblings both serve as White King's knights was genuinely remarkable. Hilda responded modestly, saying it was not particularly special and that it had simply worked out that there were open positions when the time came. Masamune pointed out that being selected at all meant they had been talented enough to earn it. Hilda acknowledged this and explained that both she and Sierra had been trained in swordsmanship from childhood and had risen through the kingdom's ranks before their abilities were recognized and they were brought into the White King's knights. She then added that when it came to Reinhardt, his story was something else entirely. She explained that Reinhardt had chosen to become a White King's knight at only 12 years of age. In her view, when people spoke of true talent, Reinhardt was the kind of person that word actually referred to. He was a genuine prodigy. However, she then added with a calm and measured expression that compared to Masamune, even Reinhardt might not appear quite so talented. Masamune looked at her with visible surprise, trying to gauge just how much she actually knew about him. Sierra noticed this immediately and cut in, telling Hilda to stop looking at Masamune in that particular way. She then turned to warn Masamune directly that he needed to be careful around her sister. Hilda looked at Sierra with mild offense at being spoken about so plainly. Sierra explained to Masamune that Hilda was the kind of person who, once she had fixed her attention on something or someone, simply did not let go. She compared her to a predatory snake in that regard. Hilda told her that was an incredibly rude way to describe her own sister. Hilda then pointed out that Masamune was not Sierra's boyfriend, so there was no real reason for Sierra to be protective in this way. Sierra's response was flustered and slightly panicked, insisting that was not what the issue was about at all. Hilda, unbothered, said that since the opportunity had presented itself, she would simply ask him directly. She turned to Masamune and asked him plainly how he felt about Sierra. Sierra's face flushed immediately, and she demanded to know why they were suddenly having this conversation. Masamune watched the two sisters and thought to himself that while he could not quite figure out how they had ended up in this particular discussion, it was clear that the two of them were genuinely close in the way that only siblings could be. The moment was interrupted by a sharp sound. A bottle of wine was slammed down hard onto the table. Both Masamune and Sierra startled at the noise. Masamune looked over at Toa and quietly asked whether she was drunk. Toa did not answer him directly. Instead, she called Sierra's name and announced that she had something to say to her. She stood up from her seat and began to speak, declaring that Masamune was hers. Masamune, watching her sway slightly on her feet, told her it was not safe for her to be standing in that condition and asked her to sit back down. Masamune looked at Toa and tried to figure out just how many bottles of wine she had managed to get through. Hilda sat back and observed the scene unfolding in front of her with quiet amusement. She turned to Sierra and remarked that it looked like Sierra had gotten herself a rival. Sierra rejected the idea immediately and told her to stop talking nonsense. Shortly after, Toa's eyes closed and she fell asleep right where she was. Masamune carefully picked her up and carried her to a bedroom to rest properly. He apologized to Sierra on Toa's behalf, saying that she tended to be like this. Sierra accepted this and then brought up something that had been sitting in her mind. She pointed out that she and Masamune had both met Toa at the same time, and yet Toa had only chosen to open up to him and no one else. She wondered why that was. Masamune admitted that he had not actually asked her about it yet, though the question had crossed his mind. He said he would ask her the next time the moment was right. Sierra told him that when he did, she wanted him to share what he found out with her as well. Sierra then led him down the hallway and opened one of the rooms, telling him it was available for him to use. Before he stepped inside, she stopped him and asked whether he had anything planned for the following day. She mentioned that she had been thinking of giving him his first swordsmanship lesson if he was free. Masamune thought about it briefly. He had been planning to go to the guild the following day since he still had no money, but he reasoned that spending some time learning from Sierra might not be a bad idea either. He told her he was happy for her to teach him the next day. Sierra smiled at hearing this, a warm and genuinely happy expression crossing her face. She told him she would see him tomorrow, and then turned and walked away quickly down the corridor. Masamune stood and watched her go, thinking to himself that he had not known Sierra was capable of making an expression like that. It was something he had not seen from her before. Before he could think on it any further, Hilda appeared at his side and whispered close to his ear, asking him whether that had come as a surprise. Masamune nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun around and asked Hilda why she was there. She said casually that she had simply been passing by. She then moved on to something more important, asking him directly whether it was true that he had defeated Raid. Masamune confirmed it, though he framed it as something that had come about more as a result than as a deliberate goal. Hilda asked whether he had done it for Toa's sake. She told him she had heard most of his story by this point, though she said she still had not quite worked out the nature of his relationship with Toa. Hilda told him that she did not need an explanation, because she could see it clearly just by watching the two of them together. Toa had feelings for him, and Masamune had feelings for Toa. Masamune shook his head and insisted that it was not like that between them. Hilda let that pass without arguing and then asked, almost as a follow-up, whether there might also be room to add Sierra into the picture. Masamune was not sure what to make of the question. Hilda explained herself. She told him that this was the first time Sierra had ever shown genuine interest in a man. It was also the first time she had ever brought people she had met outside back to their family home. She described Sierra as someone deeply earnest in everything she did, which was also what made her somewhat oblivious when it came to matters of the heart. Even when she grew close to someone, something in her mind would pull her back before she allowed herself to go any further. Hilda then said something unexpected. She told Masamune that if he ever planned to leave this country, she wanted him to take Sierra with him. Sierra had spent her entire life with a sword in her hand. She had become a knight of the kingdom while she was still very young, and Hilda said she felt genuinely sorry for her because of it. Sierra deserved to experience things beyond swords and duty, and Hilda believed she had not yet had the chance to do that. Masamune said he did not mind the idea in principle, but pointed out that he had no idea what Sierra herself would think of it, and reminded Hilda that Sierra was a knight who served the country, and that was not a small thing to walk away from. Hilda told him he did not need to act on it immediately, but when the time came, she wanted him to take Sierra with him, even if he had to do it by force. She said this last part with a serious expression on her face, making it clear she meant it. She was certain that when that moment arrived, it would be what was truly best for her sister. Masamune looked at Hilda quietly, taking in everything she had said. Hilda then let a smile return to her face, wished him a good night, and walked away. Morning came. Masamune woke up slowly and became aware that he was not alone. Toa was there in the room with him, lying in the same bed, and she greeted him cheerfully as he opened his eyes. Masamune jolted awake in a panic and greeted her back in a flustered voice, then immediately asked what she was doing there. Toa explained simply that when she had woken up earlier, there had been no one around, and so she had come to find him. She asked calmly whether she was not allowed to be there. Masamune told her he did not mind, but asked her to fix her clothes before anything else. A knock came at the door. It was Sierra, who greeted him from the other side and mentioned that it sounded like he was talking to someone. She opened the door and stopped completely still when she saw the scene in front of her. Masamune and Toa were both in the same bed. Sierra stood there unable to fully process what she was looking at. She told Masamune that she understood that as a young man he had certain needs, but before she could continue, Masamune cut her off and told her urgently that she had completely misunderstood the situation. On the other side of the door, out of sight, Hilda stood with a wide grin on her face. She had been the one who had quietly directed Toa to Masamune's room in the first place, and she was thoroughly enjoying the result of her doing so. Outside the mansion, Sierra began teaching Masamune swordsmanship while Toa sat nearby and watched the two of them. Toa observed how quickly Masamune was picking things up and suggested they take a break after a while. Masamune stood holding the wooden practice sword and reflected on what he had just been doing. He found it genuinely difficult. He had not gone into it expecting to master it in a single day. But even so, he was genuinely uncertain whether he would ever be able to learn it properly at all. He asked Sierra when she had first started learning swordsmanship. She told him she had begun at 3 years old, starting with a wooden sword just like the one he was holding now. At some point along the way, as she grew, she had transitioned to using a real sword. Masamune then turned to Toa and asked whether she also knew how to use a sword, and when her own training had begun. Toa said she did not remember the exact details clearly, but thought it had been around the same age as Sierra. She went on to share what had prompted it. When she had gone into the forest outside the castle walls one day, she had been attacked by a creature called a Leo wolf. Her father had come and saved her in time. After that experience, she had begun learning both swordsmanship and magic. Sierra's expression changed sharply when she heard the word Leo wolf. Masamune noticed and asked her whether she knew what a Leo wolf was. Sierra said she had never personally seen one, but she knew of it. A Leo wolf was a ferocious monster of S-rank classification. She asked Toa directly whether her father had truly defeated one. Toa confirmed it without hesitation and added that they still had the taxidermied remains of the creature on display inside their castle. Sierra looked genuinely stunned by this. Masamune asked what S-rank meant in practical terms and whether an S-rank monster was stronger than the Nut Kalain they had faced. Sierra told him it was far stronger, not just by a small margin. She explained that dealing with an S-rank monster would require gathering knights and adventurers from across the entire kingdom. And even with all of those forces combined, the outcome would only barely go in their favor. Masamune listened to this and said out loud that he hoped he would get the chance to encounter one someday. Sierra stared at him for a moment after hearing that. He then asked whether anyone in the country had ever actually fought an S-rank monster. Sierra said she did not know the full details, but believed that at some point in the past, someone among the White King's knights had faced one. She suggested that if he wanted to know more, Reinhardt would likely have information about it. She went on to explain that within the guild's quest system, there were S-rank missions that required the defeat of S-rank monsters. However, the area surrounding Razhausen was generally peaceful compared to other regions, which meant that accepting one of those missions would involve traveling a considerable distance to wherever the target monster was located. She also noted that S-rank missions did not always involve S-rank monsters specifically. Sometimes the target was an A-rank monster that had been given an S-rank designation due to the particular danger it posed. Every monster was its own individual case, she explained. Even two monsters of the same type could differ significantly in rank depending on their level. And if a monster reached a high enough level, it could surpass even the existing ranking categories entirely. Masamune thought about this and posed a hypothetical question. He asked what rank a level 500 mimic would fall under within the guild system. Sierra considered this and told him that a monster at that level would be classified as unranked. The guild's ranking system only extended up to SSS, and beyond that there existed a designation called the Infinite Tier. She clarified that this was not truly a rank in the formal sense. It simply referred to monsters that had not been officially identified or documented. It was a category the guild had created to ensure that everything had some kind of classification, even if the nature of the creature was unknown. Masamune asked whether that meant a level 500 monster would be considered infinite tiers simply because it had not been identified yet. Sierra confirmed that was correct, but added that even if such a monster had been identified, it would still be listed as unranked rather than given a numbered tier. The infinite tier designation was the guild's practical way of accounting for things that existed beyond the boundaries of what they had formally categorized. Masamune then asked her directly whether she thought level 500 monsters actually existed somewhere in the world. Sierra said she would not go so far as to say they definitely did not, but pointed out a significant problem with trying to confirm their existence. If anyone ever encountered a monster at that level, they would not survive the encounter, which meant there would be no one left to report back and provide information about it. Because of this, such monsters would remain permanently unidentified, which was precisely why they stayed in the infinite tier with no further details attached to them. Masamune turned this over in his mind and found himself thinking back to the dungeon he had traveled through when he first arrived in this world. He thought about Cheyenne and how much the man had seemed to know. There were so many questions he had never gotten around to asking him, and now those answers were gone. He thought quietly to himself that perhaps he should not have let Cheyenne die. There had been a great deal of knowledge in that person, and he had lost access to all of it. As the afternoon wore on, Toa eventually grew bored of simply watching from the side. She stood up and joined in the training herself. From that point on, Masamune found himself being taught swordsmanship by two teachers at once, with both Sierra and Toa taking turns instructing him through the rest of the day. That night, a disorienting sensation washed over Masamune as he found himself standing in what appeared to be an ancient, weathered shrine. The environment was utterly unfamiliar, sparking an immediate sense of bewilderment. By all logical accounts, he should have been fast asleep in the comfort of Sierra's house, which led him to ponder the unsettling possibility that he had somehow passed away in his sleep. His frantic thoughts were interrupted by a sudden greeting, prompting him to turn toward the source of the sound. Standing there was Shane. Masamune's mind raced with questions about the unexpected presence of his acquaintance. But before panic could fully set in, Shane calmly instructed him to follow along for a short moment. Filled with profound confusion, Masamune fell in a step behind him. Their brief walk ended before another figure who was quietly waiting. This individual noted that Masamune had finally arrived, clarifying that it was actually his doing that had summoned Masamune to this location. Curiosity and caution compelled Masamune to inquire about the stranger's identity and whether he was an ally of Shane. The mysterious figure pointed out that Masamune naturally failed to recognize him in his current physical form. To clear the confusion, the man altered his physical manifestation, shifting his presence into a dark, shadow-like entity, and asked if his identity was clearer now. The visual shift, combined with the instantly recognizable voice, triggered a sharp memory in Masamune. He recalled this being as the very presence that had previously offered him immense power. The true nature of the entity suddenly became clear to him. Shane stepped forward to formalize the introduction, identifying the shadow as one of his comrades and beginning to speak his name. Before the name could fully leave Shane's lips, the entity shouted sharply at him, cutting the disclosure short and startling Masamune. Turning his gaze back to Shane, the entity sternly remarked that no further details needed to be spoken. Submitting to the authority of the entity, Shane offered a quiet apology and fell silent. Masamune expressed his frustration, questioning why the entity refused to offer even a basic introduction when he had been brought to an unknown realm without any context. He pressed for at least a minimal explanation. Observing the dynamic between the two, Masamune relied on his instincts and deduced that this mysterious being was likely the god of revenge. Shane's sudden hesitation and startled reaction upon nearly blurting out his comrade's name seemed to confirm the weight and danger surrounding the entity's true identity. The entity then explained that this realm was nowhere in particular for Masamune, but served as a prison for themselves. He offered reassurance, explaining that Masamune's physical body remained safely asleep in his bed at that very moment. What had been brought into this realm was merely the manifestation of his soul. Seeking clarity, Masamune asked for a deeper explanation regarding how such a feat was possible. The entity elaborated that the elixir Masamune had consumed possessed a unique property that established a direct spiritual connection between the creator and the consumer. It was through this bound connection that his soul had been pulled into the realm. Masamune redirected the conversation to the nature of the elixir itself, asking what it truly was. The entity revealed that the potent liquid had been crafted using his own blood. He detailed its specific properties, noting that it granted a single unique skill to anyone who drank it. While the specific skill bestowed was entirely random, it was guaranteed to fall into an infinite tier, essentially an unidentified and unquantifiable ability. He added a caveat that certain skills within that realm of power might remain unusable to the recipient. The entity remarked that Masamune had been extraordinarily fortunate to receive an ability strong enough to defeat an opponent as formidable as Shane. Masamune acknowledged the immense value of the skill, admitting that it had saved him on crucial occasions and expressing genuine gratitude for its acquisition. However, he questioned why he had been singled out to receive such a gift. The entity dismissed the notion of personal selection, clarifying that he had not specifically chosen Masamune at all. The entire scenario could have happened to anyone. The elixir had simply been placed in the world on a reckless whim for experimental purposes, and Masamune had merely been the person who happened to stumble upon it. Masamune realized the grim implication of those words. Had it not been for a stroke of luck or the entity's capricious experiment, he would have met his end, devoured by the mimic. Sensibly, the entity suggested that it was time to move on to the primary purpose of the summons. Masamune agreed, expressing a strong desire to finish the matter quickly and return to his physical body in bed. At that point, Shane approached Masamune and announced that he would now be imparting his swordsmanship to him. This declaration left Masamune thoroughly perplexed. Having already spent the entire day undergoing rigorous sword training, he questioned the necessity of engaging in further practice with two ancient figures in such a strange, isolated environment. He openly asked if this training was the sole reason behind his soul being summoned. The mysterious entity interjected, explaining that certain details could not be revealed, including the explicit reasons why information was being withheld. He stated simply that Shane's duty was to transfer his mastery of the sword to Masamune, a process that would be completed in a mere instant. Masamune attempted to push for answers once more, asking if the secrecy was somehow tied to the refusal to share the entity's true name. Once again, the entity flatly stated that such information could not be disclosed. Turning his focus back to Shane, Masamune questioned his presence in this realm, asking how he could be standing here when he was supposed to be dead, and demanding to know what had truly transpired. Shane simply offered the same evasive response, stating that he was forbidden from sharing that truth. Masamune was left surrounded by unanswered questions, frustrated by the continuous wall of silence from both figures. Having previously mentioned that this place served as a prison, the idea lingered in Masamune's mind, making him wonder if they were actively bound or restrained by some unseen force. Accepting the futility of pushing further, Masamune relented, stating that he understood and would refrain from asking any more questions. Shane offered a warm smile along with a quiet apology for the secrecy. The mysterious entity added that Masamune would eventually uncover the answers to his questions in due time, reassuring him that there was no need to rush the process. Shane then announced that the time had come to transfer his personal swordsmanship directly to him. Repeating his companion's earlier words, Shane noted that the transfer would conclude in an instant. However, he cautioned Masamune that the process would inflict a level of pain equal to what he had endured when he first consumed the elixir, asking if he was truly prepared to proceed. Masamune reasoned that he would likely be fine, considering how much he had leveled up since that time and how much stronger his physical body had become, assuming the agony would not be as severe as his initial experience. With Masamune's consent, Shane placed his hand directly onto Masamune's head, his expression softening into a gentle smile. Almost instantly, a vivid surge of magical energy ignited within Masamune's mind. A vast array of martial forms and intricate sword techniques flooded his consciousness, feeling as though every single movement and posture was being permanently burned into his brain, as if he had spent 1,000 years practicing them endlessly. Just as suddenly as the sensation had begun, Masamune realized that the overwhelming pain had completely vanished. Shane inquired about his current state and how he felt. Masamune reflected on the sudden influx of knowledge, listing the various memories and styles now embedded in his mind, including the snake technique, the Rinto style, the cockatrice technique, the Beast King technique, Greyberg-style Kenjutsu, Imperial-style Kenjutsu, and countless other distinct sword disciplines. Among the vast array of martial arts, Masamune pointed out that there was one specific technique whose name he could not recognize. Shane explained that the nameless style was his own personal swordsmanship. He detailed how he had analyzed all of those diverse combat styles and utilized his extensive battle experience as a foundation to craft a unique form of swordsmanship that possessed no inherent weaknesses. Shane emphasized that Masamune would undoubtedly require this mastery in the journey ahead, advising him to simply accept the gift for now without questioning it further. Before the moment could settle, the shadow-like man interjected with a new instruction, directing Masamune to travel to the city of Bahamut. He instructed him to locate a specific woman named Khalifa once he arrived there and to deliver a precise message to her. "I will wait on that hill." Masamune felt a wave of mild exasperation, thinking to himself that despite having no clear understanding of the grand situation, his list of tasks kept growing longer. The man offered a further instruction, explaining that if the woman were to ask a follow-up question, Masamune should simply respond with the phrase in the third drawer, which would provide her with all the context she needed. Scratching his head at the strange request, Masamune admitted that he had originally set out merely to have a normal, straightforward adventure. Nevertheless, acknowledging that he owed the man a significant debt, he agreed to fulfill the request whenever he happened to visit that town. The man acknowledged his compliance, adding one final piece of advice as a strong suggestion. He recommended that Masamune enroll in an academy to formally study the principles of magic. Masamune immediately pointed out his current limitations, reminding the man that his class was merely that of a healer. The entity assured him that his specialization would pose no obstacle whatsoever, explaining that formal study would expand his overall knowledge and allow him to discover deeper applications within his existing occupation. Even if his capabilities were strictly limited to recovery and support-type spells, academic study would allow him to significantly broaden his spell repertoire, concluding with the encouraging thought that magic itself was fundamentally limitless. For a healer like Masamune, these encouraging words felt like a genuine source of hope, prompting him to readily agree to the suggestion. Shane then brought up another matter, directing Masamune's attention to his serpent sword. He suggested that Masamune hand the weapon over to the demon girl, pointing out that the sword possessed rather unusual properties that ultimately made it ill-suited for Masamune's own use. Masamune nodded, accepting the advice without hesitation. However, a sudden realization struck him, leading him to question how Shane knew about Toa in the first place, making him realize that these entities had been continuously observing his journey all along. Before he could demand an explanation, Masamune felt the physical strength draining from his body as his vision blurred rapidly. The mysterious man observed that their time had finally run out, informing Masamune that pulling his soul into this space was not something they could perform frequently, hinting that this encounter might very well be their final conversation. As their voices began to fade into silence, Masamune's connection to the realm completely severed. Shifted away from the mysterious shrine, the scene moves to the town district within the royal capital of Razhausen. An individual walked through the streets before stepping inside, one of the local residences. Upon her arrival, a man waiting inside greeted her respectfully, addressing her as Madame Fran and offering an apology for causing her the trouble of traveling all the way to meet him. Madame Fran graciously dismissed his concern, stating that it was no trouble at all and thanking him for the invitation. The host introduced himself as Jaido and presented the woman standing beside him as his assistant, Yuni. The assistant offered a polite greeting, noting that a long time had passed since they last met, and asked Madame Fran if she had been keeping well, to which Yuni affirmed that she was doing fine. Getting straight to the purpose of the gathering, Madame Fran inquired about the specific reason she had been invited there. Jaido adopted a serious tone as he revealed that a slight problem had arisen. Jaido explained that the spirit beast she had dispatched had been slain and rendered entirely useless, news that clearly caught Madame Fran off guard. Surprised, she inquired about the casualty count among the White King's knights, only for Jaido to clarify that not a single knight had lost their life. He elaborated that an unidentified adventurer had intercepted the creature before the knights could even arrive, leaving the spirit beast utterly battered and bloodied by the time the squad reached the scene. Hearing the vivid description of the beast being bloodied, Madame Fran remarked that it was a rather unusual phrasing. Jaido went on to share that he had instructed Yun-E to retrieve the corpse from the autopsy team, expressing his desire for Madame Fran to employ her magic once more to resurrect the fallen creature. Understanding his request without hesitation, Madame Fran handed a peculiar jar over to Jaido. Inspecting the container with curiosity, Jaido questioned what it held inside. Madame Fran explained that the moment she received his invitation, she had already anticipated the exact favor he would ask of her, presenting the jar as a personal gift. When Jaido asked once again about its contents, she revealed that it contained a whole army of monsters. A satisfied smile spread across Jaido's face as he expressed his delight, to which Madame Fran shared her gratification that the gift pleased him. She noted that the creatures sealed within were all ranked B and above, adding that she had even secured a few S-rank monsters, assuming he might find a use for such overwhelming force. Curious about her methods, Jaido inquired where she had managed to procure such high-ranking beasts. Madame Fran explained that she had requisitioned several resources from the laboratory following his departure from the Empire, successfully restoring a portion of them for this purpose. Shifting the focus, she asked when he intended to make his move. Jaido stated that his plan would commence in a week's time, emphasizing that until then, he wished to multiply the number of spirit beasts as much as possible. With their business concluded, Madame Fran took her leave and departed from the house. Left alone with Jaido, Yuni voiced her skepticism, admitting that she doubted the revived beast would be of much practical use. Jaido merely smiled, observing that the creature would serve as a crucial form of insurance, especially given the distinct possibility that the mysterious adventurer might attempt to intervene once again. Masamune sat at the morning table, entirely lost in the restless flow of his own thoughts. He could not erase the memory of what Cheyenne and the mysterious man had spoken to him during his dreams, where they had desperately begged him to search for them and bring them help. His quiet distraction was suddenly interrupted when Toa spoke up, asking him what he had just said. The unexpected question caught Masamune completely off guard. Toa mentioned that it seemed as though Masamune had whispered something aloud, but Masamune quickly shook his head and insisted that nothing was wrong and that he had not uttered a word. Sierra looked across at him with deep concern in her eyes, noting that his complexion was unusually pale and asking if he was feeling ill. Masamune attempted to reassure her by claiming that he felt no different than he usually did. Sierra remained doubtful, pointing out that during the early morning swordsmanship practice, he had done nothing more than sit on the sidelines and watch. The long-haired woman joined in the conversation, remarking that he had not even picked up a training weapon for a single moment. Hearing this, the short-haired woman let out a small gasp of surprise, wondering aloud if Masamune had suddenly grown to dislike their daily physical training. Masamune quickly corrected her, explaining that he still enjoyed practice as much as ever and could genuinely feel his personal skills growing. He added that for today, he simply felt a strong desire to walk around the town and explore his surroundings. The long-haired woman accepted his explanation with a calm gesture and continued eating her morning meal, while Masamune asked the group not to worry about him any further. In truth, Masamune was completely unable to push the strange events of the previous night out of his mind. The experience occupied his entire conscious thought, making it impossible for him to focus on any ordinary task. Earlier that morning, while observing the mock battle between Sierra and Toa, a strange and remarkable realization had washed over him. As he watched their sharp movements, their battle action seemed to unfold before his eyes in slow motion, allowing him to easily predict every swing, step, and strike before it occurred. This shocking perception proved beyond any doubt that what he had experienced the night before was far from a simple dream. He recognized that if he were to pick up a sword and fight alongside them now, His movements and technical handling of the blade would be so drastically altered compared to yesterday that everyone present would immediately become suspicious and demand answers. Knowing this, he spent his time trying to construct a believable excuse so he could avoid participating in tomorrow's training without raising alarm. Their quiet routine was shattered when Toa suddenly called out to Sierra, urging her to look at what was occurring outside. Standing near the street was a large, menacing man holding a young child who was desperately struggling to escape his tight grasp. Tears streamed down the young girl's face as she squirmed in fear. Taking a closer look at her distinct animal ears and tail, Masamune realized that she belonged to the beast folk race. Toa offered a quick apology to Masamune and Sierra for dragging them into trouble, but Sierra immediately insisted that they pursue the fleeing man without a second of delay, recognizing that he was almost certainly an active slave merchant. The heavy-set merchant dragged the weeping girl through the shadow of the back alleys until he reached a hidden cell. He violently shoved her inside the dark enclosure and shouted for another man to secure her inside a sturdy cage. Hearing that the new captive was a member of the beast folk, the second man expressed immediate interest, agreeing that a rare girl of her kind would easily command an exceptionally high price from wealthy buyers. The large merchant sternly warned his partner not to inflict any physical harm or injuries upon her that might lessen her value. The second man simply chuckled in response, promising that he understood the instructions. Turning toward the trembling girl locked within the iron bars, the keeper coldly warned her to remain completely obedient and quiet. He threatened that if she dared to make any trouble or create a scene, she would regret it, specifically warning her that she would not want her soft ears sliced off as punishment. Laughing cruelly to himself, he turned and walked away. Deep within the cold darkness of the cage, the little girl wept silently as tears fell down her face, quietly calling out for her older sister and the rest of her family to save her. Her small body shuddered with terror as a heavy pair of leather boots suddenly appeared directly in front of her cage. A bald man crouched down to her eye level, inspecting her through the bars and commenting to his partner that they had managed to capture a particularly valuable specimen today. The merchant agreed with pride, pointing out that she was a rare member of the white cat race and an absolute treasure to possess. The bald man nodded enthusiastically, comparing her favorably to an unfortunate woman they had held captive a few days prior. Observing that their overall boss was currently away from the premises, the bald man suggested in a low tone that they spend a little time entertaining themselves with the girl while they had the chance. The young child's eyes widened in sheer panic upon hearing his sinister intent. The woman standing nearby offered her approval, assuring them that the boss would never notice even if the child suffered a few minor injuries during their cruel game. The cage keeper smiled and agreed that it sounded like a fine idea, admitting that his personal stress had been building up over the past several days. He approached the frightened child, telling her that she should listen carefully and stop resisting. He warned her to stay perfectly still so that they could finish quickly without any unnecessary fuss. When the keeper reached out and forcibly grabbed her small hand, the little girl screamed in desperation, repeatedly shouting her refusal. The man insincerely tried to calm her, telling her there was no reason to be afraid or to make such a fuss. The keeper then impatiently told the bald man to hurry up and join him before their boss returned to the hideout. The bald man grumbled back, telling his companion not to rush him through the process. Before anyone could move any further, the keeper suddenly let out a strangled groan and collapsed face first onto the hard ground, completely unconscious. The nearby woman gasped in utter shock, turning her head toward the back of the room just as a tremendous explosion tore through the structure, filling the space with noise, dust, and flying debris. The terrified beastfolk girl shielded her face and looked toward the source of the blast. Walking calmly through the settling dust, Masamune cracked the knuckles on his hands. He remarked to himself that knocking these criminal slavers unconscious would be more than enough to resolve the problem. Approaching the iron cage, he looked down at the small child and softly asked if she was unhurt. He explained that he had accidentally seen her being carried off by the merchant earlier and had followed them to rescue her, gently assuring her that he was a friend and would never cause her any harm. Extending a warm, open hand toward her through the open space, he promised that he was going to break her out and lead her to safety. A short time later, Masamune emerged from the dark alleyway carrying the young girl. Waiting at the entrance were Sierra and Toa, who smiled warmly and waved to catch his attention as he approached. The small child rested against him, softly stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds as she attempted to pronounce Masamune's name. Masamune chuckled softly, confirming that she had gotten his name right, and then gently asked her what her own name was. The little girl looked up at him and quietly introduced herself as Nimue. Sierra crouched down to bring herself to eye level with the child, offering a gentle smile as she expressed how lovely it was to meet her. Sierra then asked where Nimue lived and where her home was located. Nimue looked back at her with trusting eyes and answered that her home was wherever her beloved sister was waiting for her. Sierra immediately understood Nimue's meaning, realizing that her home was actually a local church. When Toa expressed confusion and asked for clarification, Sierra explained that in this area, churches often served as orphanages where children in need were temporarily taken care of and protected. It was clear from this that Nimue was one of the many young children living under their care. Upon their arrival at the building, Masamune observed the structure with quiet curiosity, thinking to himself that the place resembled an old, grand mansion far more than a typical church. Nimue pushed open the heavy front door and immediately called out to the nun upon spotting her inside. The nun gasping in utter shock at the sight of the young child. Nimue lowered her head in apology, admitting that she was sorry for getting captured by a frightening man, but quickly added that Masamune had rescued her from danger. Following her explanation, Masamune, Toa, and Sierra all bowed respectfully toward the grateful nun. Once they were seated inside, the nun listened attentively as the group explained the full situation, including the fact that a slave merchant had been responsible for the abduction. Overwhelmed with emotion, the nun expressed her deepest gratitude to the three travelers for bringing Nimue back safely, confessing that she had no idea how she could ever properly repay them for their heroism. Sierra warmly reassured her, telling the nun not to worry about any reward, as they were simply glad that Nimue was unhurt. The nun explained that Nimue had a habit of occasionally sneaking out of the church to visit her friends elsewhere in the city. She noted that because the royal capital was generally considered a safe environment where people did not harbor prejudice or discriminate against the beast folk, she had believed there was no real danger in letting her wander. She admitted with regret that she had been foolish to assume the child was completely safe, never imagining that a slave merchant would operate in broad daylight, especially when such practice was strictly forbidden by law. Masamune picked up on her words and asked if slavery was truly banned in this region. Sierra affirmed that it was, explaining that while she had omitted the details earlier, the buying, selling, and kidnapping of individuals into slavery was completely illegal throughout the territory of Razhausen. However, she noted bitterly that despite the strict prohibition, criminal elements still carried out these illegal activities in secret dark corners of the city. She added that if Toa had not noticed the merchant earlier that morning, Nimue's fate would have been tragically different. As they spoke, Masamune noticed something unusual and called out to the sister, asking her about the strange mark visible on Nimue's left arm. Alarmed by his question, the sister immediately moved to inspect the child's arm, gasping as her eyes filled with tears at the sight of a distinct crest. Clasping Nimue tightly in a sudden embrace, she cried out in sorrow over the discovery. Nimue, confused by the emotional reaction, gently urged the nun not to cry. Sierra quietly explained that the mark was a slave crest, a permanent brand that merchants carved into the skin of their captives. She noted that while such marks were commonly inflicted on male slaves, Nimue had likely received one due to her status as a beastfolk child. Although the crest possessed no magical properties or physical effects, it served as a psychological chain intended to break a victim's spirit and make them relinquish all hope of escape by constantly reminding them that they were owned. Listening to the explanation, Masamune felt a surge of cold fury, wondering how many innocent lives those ruthless criminals had destroyed with their cruel actions. Although he knew he should let Sierra handle the legal matters rather than killing the slavers on the spot, his internal anger bled through his expression. Noticing his tense demeanor, Sierra gently touched his hand and asked if he was all right, remarking that he was making a frightening face. Masamune blinked in confusion, but Sierra reassured him, telling him not to worry and to leave the rest of the matter to them. She mentioned that she had already contacted Annette to deal with the situation legally. Masamune accepted her words, agreeing that Sierra was right, while Sierra promised him that everything would be taken care of properly. Sometime later, as the group prepared to leave the church grounds, Nimue ran outside and asked with a disappointed expression if Masamune and his companions were already departing. Seeing her crestfallen face, Masamune gently warned her to be extremely cautious for the time being and to refrain from wandering off on her own again. Nimue nodded in agreement and gave them a cheerful wave, calling out that she would see them tomorrow. As they walked away, Toa turned to Masamune and asked if they were planning to visit the church again the following day. Masamune expressed doubt, prompting Toa to point out that he had just promised Nimue he would see her tomorrow. Masamune reasoned that Nimue was already playing happily with the other children as if nothing traumatic had occurred, expressing his belief that by the time tomorrow arrived, the young child would have already forgotten all about him. However, the very next morning, a bright and giddy voice called out to her master. Masamune turned around in complete shock to find Nimue standing right before him. Astonished by her sudden appearance, he demanded to know why she was there. With a cheerful smile, Nimue blithely declared that she had come to meet her master, leaving Masamune thoroughly bewildered as he repeated the unfamiliar title back to her. Nimue looked up at Masamune and asked where they were currently heading together. Masamune explained that they were making their way toward the local adventurer guild, noting that while he had been staying as a guest at Sierra's house for some time, he could not continue relying on her generosity indefinitely without earning his own living. Upon hearing his explanation, Nimue excitedly declared that Masamune was indeed a true, professional adventurer, enthusiastically adding that she was going to accompany him wherever he went. As they walked together, Sierra spoke up, admitting that a question had been weighing on her mind regarding why Nimue insisted on addressing Masamune as her master. Masamune quickly defended himself, frantically assuring everyone that he had never instructed the child to use such a formal title with him. Sierra looked at him with slight skepticism, asking if that was truly the case. Toa then turned to Nimue and directly asked her why she kept using the word master to refer to Masamune. Nimue cheerfully explained that the habit came directly from an important lesson her mother had taught her long ago. She recalled her mother telling her that if anyone ever stepped forward to save her life, she was obligated to cherish and devote herself to that person for the remainder of her days. Because Masamune had rescued her from the slave traders, she viewed him as her undisputed master. Hearing her earnest explanation, Sierra conceded that if Nimue held such a deep personal belief, they had no choice but to accept her reasoning. Their conversation caught the attention of a nearby store owner named Sharon, who called out to Nimue and asked if the group was acquainted with the young beastfolk girl. Nimue raised her hand with great pride to introduce her companions, formally presenting Masamune as her master. Upon hearing the title, Sharon's face immediately twisted into her expression of deep disgust and suspicion. Observing her reaction, Masamune felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, realizing that he was once again trapped in a confusing and troublesome misunderstanding. He attempted to quickly interject and explain that there was a perfectly innocent reason behind her chosen form of address. After listening to the full story and understanding the context, Sharon turned to inspect Nimue, commenting with relief that the poor child must have endured a terrible ordeal. She expressed genuine gratitude toward Masamune and his friends for rescuing Nimue, revealing that the young girl frequently visited her shop to play and that she regarded Nimue almost as her own daughter. Sharon admitted that if given the opportunity, she would love to personally punch the evil individuals who had tried to bring harm to the child. However, Sharon added with a sigh that she could hardly believe the time had come to see Nimue embark on her own path so soon. She stepped up to Masamune and firmly tapped his shoulder, her expression turning deadly serious. She reminded him that Nimue had chosen him to be her master, warning him in no uncertain terms that he must never let her down. She sternly declared that if any harm were ever to befall Nimue under his care, she would personally track him down and punch him directly in the face. Stunned by her fierce warning, Masamune opened his eyes wide and instinctively gave a respectful affirmation. Inwardly, he pondered whether there was a profound responsibility attached to accepting Nimue's loyalty, acknowledging that Sharon's intense protectiveness was simply the natural impulse of a guardian. Meanwhile, Nimue whispered quietly to herself that Sharon could be quite terrifying when angry. Just then, a newly arrived man approached the group, announcing that he had been searching everywhere for Sierra. Sharon greeted the man, addressing him as Edward, before pointing out that he was still wearing his undercover appearance in plain public view. She teased him about being overly cautious, but Edward defended his choice, claiming that nobody in the city would ever suspect him of being one of the elite knights serving the White King while wearing his ordinary civilian clothes, which he considered his natural attire anyway. Edward then inquired about the identities of the companions standing alongside Sharon. Sharon formally introduced Masamune, Toa, and Nimue to the newcomer. Upon hearing their names, Edward seemed to recognize Masamune from recent rumors circulating around the capital. He politely bowed and apologized for his delayed introduction, formally identifying himself as Edward Scotch, a proud knight serving under the White King, and expressed his pleasure at meeting them all. Sierra cut straight to the point, asking Edward why he had been actively searching for her. Removing his hat out of respect, Edward produced an official parchment scroll issued directly by King Reinhardt and handed it to her. Sierra took the scroll and unrolled it, immediately recognizing the royal seal affixed to the document. Edward explained that the document contained an urgent personal request from the king himself. He revealed that a dangerous monster known as a basilisk had suddenly appeared in the region of WIC, specifically making its lair inside a farm barn owned by Boreas, a close personal friend of the king. Surprised by the news, Sierra questioned the unexpected appearance of such a creature. Nimue happily chimed in, excitedly boasting that she knew what a basilisk was, describing it as a monstrously gigantic serpent. Sierra asked Edward why the king had assigned this specific task to her, but Edward admitted he did not possess the details, stating that his only order was to deliver the official request directly into her hands. He expressed confidence that the king possessed his own valid strategic reasons for selecting Sierra for the job. Hearing about the mission, Sharon decided to seize the opportunity to request a personal favor while Sierra was dispatched on the official assignment. When Toa asked what she needed, Sharon explained that her shop was currently completely out of rare monster materials, specifically requiring the tear gland, the poison sac, and the large venomous fangs of a basilisk. She asked if Sierra would be willing to harvest those specific components for her after slaying the beast. Masamune spoke up without hesitation, offering to accompany Sierra on the dangerous hunt to assist her. Toa immediately joined in, stating that if Masamune was going into battle, she would gladly go as well. Sierra looked at both of them and asked if they were truly certain about putting themselves in danger. Masamune reassured her, explaining that it was high time he repaid her hospitality for allowing them to live under her roof for so long. Satisfied with his answer, Sierra accepted their help. Seeing the party come together, Sharon suggested that they take young Nemu along on the trip as well. Masamune reacted with complete shock, pointing out that Nemu was still just a little child and that the mission was far too hazardous. Hearing his protest, Nemu looked up at him with sad eyes, asking if he truly intended to leave her behind all by herself. Masamune tried to reason with her, gently explaining that they were setting out to fight a terrifying monster. Nemu stubbornly maintained her stance, arguing passionately that she wanted to go along so she could prove useful to her master. When Toa tried to step in and mediate the debate, Sharon told them all not to worry about bringing the child along, reassuring them that everything would turn out completely fine. Sharon revealed the surprising truth behind her suggestion, explaining that despite her small, innocent appearance and tender age, Nemu was actually a highly skilled healer who possessed far greater power than any of them could imagine. In fact, among the locals and nearby adventurers, the young beastfolk girl was actually quite famous for her incredible capabilities. Masamune could not help but feel a wave of sheer disbelief wash over him, thinking to himself how absurd it was that someone with such remarkable strength had somehow managed to get captured so easily by ordinary slave traders in the first place. Noticing his hesitation, Nemu looked up at Masamune with big, teary eyes, pleading silently for his permission to join the expedition. Unable to withstand her pathetic expression any longer, Masamune gave in with a soft sigh, firmly telling her that he would allow her to come along just this once, but strictly on the condition that she stay safe. Overjoyed by his decision, Nemu beamed brightly and excitedly shouted her agreement, eager to prove her worth to her master. The horse-drawn carriage rolled smoothly along the dirt road, carrying the party toward their distant destination. Inside, Sierra let out an exasperated sigh, openly complaining about how much of a ruthless slave driver the king was for personally ordering her to handle a task as mundane as slaying a mere basilisk. She grumbled that any ordinary adventurer dispatched from the local guild could easily have taken care of the problem on their own. Moreover, given that the request had been formally processed through official guild channels anyway, she saw absolutely no reason why a high-ranking knight like herself needed to travel out to the countryside in person. Attempting to soothe her frustration, Masamune gently suggested that she view the journey as a convenient way to fulfill Sharon's favor for rare monster materials. Sierra conceded that he made a fair point, though her annoyance remained palpable, leaving Masamune to silently wonder why this specific assignment was irritating her so intensely. Seeking to pass the time, Toa turned her attention to Nemu and casually asked about her abilities, inquiring whether the young beastfolk girl possessed the capacity to cast magic. Nemu proudly clarified that while she could not perform traditional magic, she was proficient in utilizing cat fists. Puzzled by the unfamiliar term, Masamune asked for clarification. Nemu looked at him in mild disbelief, asking if he was truly ignorant of cat's feet. When Masamune confirmed that it was his very first time hearing about it, Nemu enthusiastically offered to explain the subject to him. Raising her index finger with dramatic flair, Nemu built up intense suspense, successfully capturing both Masamune and Toa's complete curiosity. However, she suddenly paused in mid-sentence and blithely admitted that she did not actually know much about the topic herself, leaving her listeners reacting with a mix of utter bewilderment and amusement. She went on to explain that all she really knew was that it was a specialized form of beast arts passed down through generations within catfolk communities. Masamune asked if that meant it was essentially a unique physical combat technique, and Sierra chimed in to elaborate, explaining that beast arts were specialized martial disciplines favored by beastfolk, varying significantly depending on a person's specific subrace. In Nemu's hometown, that particular style was commonly known as cat fist. Masamune then sought further clarification, asking Nemu to confirm whether she was entirely unable to use magic. Nemu proudly declared that she was a cat wizard, meaning that as soon as she eventually learned proper spells, she would undoubtedly be capable of wielding magic. Sierra's interest was immediately piqued by the statement, and Toa also expressed deep curiosity upon hearing the title. Toa explained to Masamune that the cat wizard class was an exceedingly rare and unique archetype exclusive to the catfolk race. She added that it was considered an inborn class of exceptionally high prestige and rank. This prompted Masamune to ask whether certain combat classes were not determined at birth. Sierra explained that while some classes were fixed from birth, others naturally advanced into higher forms as a person grew in experience and strength. Using herself as an example, Sierra noted that she had started out as an ordinary knight before eventually ascending to her current status as an elite knight. Curious about his own growth potential, Masamune asked if it was possible for someone with a basic healer class to eventually advance into a priest. Sierra offered him an apologetic look, explaining that such a progression was impossible because the priest class was also an innate, fixed designation. She added that almost all standard class advancement pathways were already well documented, and as far as history recorded, there was no known higher evolution for the basic healer class. Hearing this, Masamune felt a quiet wave of disappointment wash over him, realizing that he was destined to remain a humble healer forever. Noticing his crestfallen expression, Nimue asked Masamune if he was indeed a healer. Masamune admitted that his class was the sole reason he was restricted to utilizing basic healing and support magic. Nimue let out a small gasp of sympathy and earnestly urged him not to feel downhearted. She valiantly promised that she would personally protect her master, reminding him that because he had successfully saved her from dangerous slavers, he could not possibly be considered weak. Masamune asked if she truly believed that, and Nimue responded with absolute, unwavering confidence. Nimue then asked how much longer it would take for their carriage to reach the town of Wic. Sierra estimated that they would likely arrive sometime the following day. Realizing the distance involved, Masamune expressed mild concern that they would be forced to spend an entire night sleeping inside the traveling carriage, noting that the trip was taking longer than he had initially anticipated. Sierra explained that Wic was located quite far from the capital. Masamune then voiced a lingering worry, asking if it was truly acceptable for Sierra to depart from the royal capital so abruptly without formal notice. Sierra reassured him, explaining that Sir Edward would handle informing the higher authorities on her behalf, and adding that she had also taken the precaution of notifying Annette before their departure. Masamune pondered her words, wondering to himself when she could have possibly contacted Annette. That thought suddenly reminded him of an event from the previous day, where he had observed Sierra speaking directly into her ring. He asked Sierra if her ring possessed the magical ability to allow long-distance communication with others. Sierra confirmed his suspicion, explaining that every knight serving the White King was officially issued one of these communication rings as mandatory equipment. Masamune mentioned that he happened to possess a similar ring, which had been given to him by someone in the past, though he had never actually tested its properties. He remarked on how remarkably convenient it would be if the item allowed communication regardless of distance. Sierra clarified that her own ring only functioned within the geographical borders of the kingdom, prompting her to ask if his ring was capable of communicating across even greater distances outside the realm. Masamune replied that according to the person who gave it to him, it could indeed work anywhere. Inspecting the band closely, Sierra remarked that if his claim was true, the ring must be an extraordinarily expensive magical artifact crafted from materials of immense purity. Toa looked at Masamune with curiosity, asking who had given him such a valuable item and whether that person was a close friend of his. Masamune shook his head, explaining that the giver was definitely not a friend, but rather someone he had simply crossed paths with by pure chance. He explained that the individual had suddenly launched a violent attack against him out of nowhere, forcing Masamune to defend himself and retaliate in combat, only for the attacker to unexpectedly turn around and invite Masamune to join him as a comrade. Confused by the bizarre story, Toa asked him what he could possibly mean by such an unusual encounter. Masamune replied that his words were meant quite literally. He recalled that the moment he encountered the stranger, the man emanated an unmistakable aura of dark hostility. Just when Masamune believed the tense situation had settled and prepared to walk away, the man unexpectedly launched a powerful magic spell directly at him. Toa winced upon hearing the account, commenting that such a sudden and violent encounter sounded horribly harsh. Masamune went on to recall how the mysterious attacker claimed to represent a powerful faction, extending an invitation for Masamune to join their ranks and instructing him to carefully consider the offer before handing over the communication ring. Sierra's expression darkened as she warned that the entire situation sounded exceedingly suspicious and dangerous. Toa then inquired whether the man had disclosed the formal name of his faction, to which Masamune revealed that they called themselves Dragon's Heart. Upon hearing that name, both Sierra and Toa gasped in genuine shock. Sierra demanded to know if the man had truly spoken those exact words, and Masamune asked if she was familiar with the group. Sierra explained that she doubted there was a single person in the world who remained ignorant of Dragon's Heart. She revealed that they were infamous international targets, widely known for assassinating corrupt politicians and eliminating powerful figures involved in heinous acts of murder and embezzlement. Consequently, numerous kingdoms across the continent had placed enormous bounties on their heads. Masamune nodded, remembering that the man had indeed mentioned a grand goal regarding the complete eradication of corruption. Sierra noted that such a philosophy fit their reputation perfectly, adding that the event which originally spread the terror of Dragon's Heart across the world was the horrific Torrent Kingdom incident. Curious, the companions asked her to elaborate, and Sierra explained that the realm was once ruled by Queen Priva, a tyrannical monarch who carried out a massive, senseless genocide under the insane belief that only beautiful things should exist within her domain. Sierra noted that more than half of the kingdom's population perished in the purge, with the vast majority of victims being the elderly. Masamune deduced that the queen's atrocities were precisely what drew the murderous wrath of Dragon's heart upon her regime. Sierra affirmed his suspicion, though she solemnly added that the group did not stop at executing the tyrant queen herself. They systematically slaughtered every single individual associated with her royal line, including innocent young children. Toa mentioned that she had learned of the tragic incident through her family, recalling a past conversation where her father spoke to her mother about an acquaintance named Caper who had gone on to establish Dragon's Heart. Toa then asked Masamune what he intended to do regarding the standing invitation to join their ranks. Masamune admitted that he remained undecided, reasoning that since he had no idea when or where he might ever encounter the group again, worrying about the offer was largely pointless. Sierra agreed with his pragmatic stance, noting that modern authorities possess zero clues regarding the group's current whereabouts, though she admitted it was an extraordinarily mysterious twist of fate for Masamune to have been personally recruited by them. Masamune quietly recalled the man mentioning a planned journey to the kingdom of Grey Belka, silently wondering what the dangerous organization was currently executing in that region. Meanwhile, far near the borderlands, the towering gates of the Grey Belka kingdom were coming into view. At the border checkpoint, heavily armed guards called out a stern command for an approaching party to halt immediately. The squad leader shouted for a cloaked figure at the front of the group to lower his hood and reveal his face to the authorities. However, the mysterious traveler and his companions remained completely motionless, silently staring back at the guards. Irritated by the lack of compliance, the border officer demanded once more if the traveler was deaf, shouting for him to remove his hood and reveal his identity without further delay. The kingdom of Grey Belka was renowned throughout the region for its vast territory, which was heavily guarded by a complex network of defenses. Travelers attempting to reach the heart of the realm had to pass through an initial checkpoint gate guarding the outer border, followed by another strictly monitored gate positioned right before the entrance to the main castle town. Scattered across the surrounding lands outside the capital were numerous smaller farming villages, each enveloped by its own designated guard posts. Because of this multi-layered defensive perimeter, local authorities and common folk alike widely considered it entirely impossible for anyone to infiltrate the kingdom without being spotted. However, that long-held belief was shattered in an instant when the guards posted at the outer checkpoint were swiftly defeated and dropped unconscious to the hard ground. Looking over the fallen soldiers, a man clad in a long black cloak remarked to his comrades that the guard presence at this specific gate was surprisingly sparse, just as had been reported. One of his companions agreed, explaining that very few people ever attempted to gain entry through this particular passage, and those who did were almost exclusively ordinary merchants or passing travelers. A woman in their party observed that having only 2 guards assigned to such a post seemed unnaturally low, prompting her companion to speculate that the royal forces were likely preoccupied elsewhere battling invading demons. He added, however, that there had certainly been a much larger guard contingent present when he had last visited the region. Their conversation was suddenly cut short by the thunderous sound of approaching horses. A squad of mounted cavalry rushed past them, with one rider unsheathing his blade in a flash. Within moments, the cloaked group found themselves completely surrounded by heavily armed knights. One of the knights proudly declared that the infiltrators stood no chance of victory against their superior numbers. Before a fight could break out, an elderly man dismounted from his horse and instructed his men to stand down, announcing that he would face the intruders himself. Recognizing the old man immediately, one member of the cloak party, a man named Alfred, addressed him with familiar respect. The old man greeted Alfred in return, expressing genuine relief to see that he was still alive and healthy after so much time. However, the elderly man's expression quickly hardened into a fierce glare as he noted that Alfred was now traveling in the company of dangerous scoundrels, remarking mournfully that the king would be deeply saddened to learn of his betrayal. Alfred dismissed his sentimentality, telling the old man to stop pretending and drop his usual act. Accepting the reality of the situation, the old man observed that Alfred had clearly not returned home to reconcile, sternly demanding to know what business an infamous group like theirs could possibly have within the borders of Grey Belka, a nation that should have no dealings with such outlaws. At that moment, another member of the group stepped forward and introduced himself as Jeek. He directly confronted the old man, revealing that their organization had received credible intelligence indicating that Grey Belka was actively performing a forbidden hero summoning ritual. Jeek pointed out that this dark, prohibited magic required the sacrifice of countless innocent lives to activate, and as far as his knowledge went, there was no alternative method to trigger the spell without paying that terrible price in blood. The old man asked if they had come all this way merely to seek confirmation regarding those rumors. Jeek coldly replied that he had no intention of engaging in a debate, demanding a straight answer to his question. He warned that the forbidden summoning magic would inevitably act as the catalyst to incite brutal international wars, and promised that before such conflicts could erupt, his group would bring swift and absolute death to anyone connected to the ritual. The old man chuckled softly at the threat, remarking that Jeek had a remarkably blunt way of expressing his intentions, and advised the party not to be so overly impatient. Jeek countered that it was only a matter of time before news of the forbidden magic spread across the entire world, as the massive traces of magical power generated by a hero summoning were far too vast to be concealed or erased so easily. The old man chuckled once more, suggesting that they were free to enter the territory and investigate the truth for themselves, though he added with a sharp grin that he had never promised to let them pass through alive. Interpreting his words, Jeek concluded that the old man intended to resist them to the end, which meant he would simply have to die right then and there. Jeek then addressed the old man by his legendary true name, Albert Morlow. Albert expressed slight surprise, calling Jeek a cheeky brat for having recognized his true identity from the very beginning. Jeek turned to his two companions and instructed them to step back, declaring that he would handle the battle alone. Alfred warned Jeek to exercise extreme caution, reminding him that despite Albert's fragile and elderly appearance, the man was a master sage of incredible power. Jeek reassured Alfred, promising that he had no intention of underestimating the legendary figure widely known as the Magician of the Forest. Hearing this, Albert scoffed, remarking that it was a pity Jeek insisted on fighting alone, as the party might have stood a slight chance of survival had all three of them attacked him simultaneously. He added that Jeek was foolishly underestimating his grand power, concluding that Dragon's Heart was clearly an organization composed of arrogant fools. With his eyes blazing, Albert declared that he would personally put an end to Jeek's life right then and there. Without another word, Jeek unleashed his latent inner power, causing violent crackles of bright lightning to surge around his body as he activated his formidable Dragon Force capabilities. Simultaneously, Albert unleashed the vast, ancient power of the forest, summoning raw magical energy to crush his opponent. Amidst the chaos of clashing forces, Jeek seized a momentary opening in the sage's defenses and lunged forward, executing a lethal sword strike directly against Albert. A massive, deafening explosion detonated upon impact, sending shockwaves through the air as the two powerful combatants locked eyes through the clearing smoke, embarking on a tense and deadly stare-down. As Albert lay bloody and defeated upon the hard ground, his fading voice gasped out that he had never envisioned meeting his ultimate end in combat like this. Looking up at his opponent, the dying sage muttered that Jeek was most certainly not an ordinary human, weakly asking if he was actually a dragon, as he dimly recalled encountering one of the legendary beasts during his early youth. Jeek coldly replied that he had no obligation to answer such questions. Albert chuckled softly, observing with a faint smile that Jeek was too ruthless to grant a dying old man even a single answer. Unmoved by his words, Jeek repeated his primary question, demanding to know once and for all if the kingdom of Grey Belka had indeed performed the forbidden hero summoning ritual. Albert quietly confirmed that Jeek already knew the truth, noting that where there was smoke, there was inevitably fire. However, Albert added that the kingdom had already meticulously erased all physical evidence of the act, assuring Jeek that he would find nothing remaining. He explained that a full month had already passed since the ritual took place, leaving the royal faction with plenty of time to accomplish their goals and ensure that any lingering traces of magic power completely vanished. To his surprise, Jeek plainly stated that the lack of physical proof did not matter in the slightest. Albert blinked in confusion, asking what he could possibly mean, to which Jeek explained that Albert's verbal acknowledgement of the summoning ritual was more than enough justification for their upcoming actions. Hearing this, Albert argued that what Jeek and his companions were planning to do was not an act of noble retribution, but simply an indiscriminate massacre without cause. Jeek retorted by questioning the very concept of justice, stating that justice was merely a matter of personal belief rather than a concrete truth, and asserting that their mission had never been about simple concepts of good and evil. Albert then turned his gaze toward Alfred, asking if this cruel outcome was truly what he wished for, and wondering if seeing his former mentor in such a pitiful state stirred any emotion within his heart. He asked where the kind, compassionate prince he once knew had gone. Alfred coldly shot down his emotional appeal, stating that he had never held any affection or sympathy for Albert, feeling nothing toward him but utter disgust. Alfred condemned Albert for waging a bloody war against the demon race and performing forbidden, life-draining magic at the terrible expense of his own subjects, declaring that such foolish choices meant the entire kingdom was already beyond saving. Albert quietly defended humanity's actions, claiming that humans were inherently driven to act that way and that it made no sense to expect otherwise. Alfred declined to debate him further, remarking that perhaps Albert was fortunate to die holding on to such delusions. Telling the dying man that he was finished talking and that he should simply go ahead and die, Alfred offered no further warmth. Albert chuckled faintly at the harsh response, noting that telling a dying old man to hurry up and perish proved that Alfred was truly no longer the gentle prince he used to know. Meanwhile, far away from the bloodshed, young Nemu was running happily through a bustling street, shouting out to her master in pure wonder at her surroundings. She marveled at the sheer number of vibrant shops lining the roads, thrilled to finally have arrived in the lively town of WIC. Seeing the crowded streets packed with travelers and merchants, Sierra explained that the settlement was famous for being a premier commercial hub, adding that the marketplace could grow even more congested than it currently was. Toa gasped in disbelief, asking if it could truly get any more crowded than this. Excited by the bustling atmosphere, Nemu pleaded with Masamune to let her buy a few things, but Masamune gently explained that since they had arrived on business, they needed to visit the local ranch first before doing any personal sightseeing after completing their official request. Later that afternoon, the group arrived near the outskirts of the ranch, where the soft mooing of cattle echoed through the air. Standing nearby, Toa found herself engaged in an intense staring match with a large, strange cow. She muttered discontentedly that she refused to accept that the creature was a Wallstein, complaining that it lacked any charm or cuteness whatsoever. Masamune called back to her, warning her to keep up so she would not get left behind. Approaching the primary residence on the property, Sierra knocked firmly on the front door and called out to ask if anyone was home. When only silence answered her call, Toa noted that the house appeared to be completely vacant, and Sierra agreed that nobody seemed to be inside. Just then, Nemu called out to Masamune, pointing toward a large group of local townspeople gathered nearby. As the party drew closer, they overheard the heated arguments of the agitated crowd. Some of the locals were pressuring an old man to give up his land, complaining about the constant terror they had to endure every single day, and insisting that driving the monster away was paramount. They argued that abandoning the ranch was a very small price to pay for the safety of the community, suggesting that since the ranch owner was already advanced in age, it was time for him to relinquish his property and live out the rest of his days somewhere quiet. The elderly ranch owner, named Boreas, desperately begged his neighbors to wait just a little longer, explaining that he had already submitted an official request directly to the Adventurer Guild in the distant capital. The townspeople dismissed his plea, arguing that he had made the exact same excuse yesterday and pointing out that no adventurers from the capital had shown up to help. Boreas maintained his faith, insisting that the dispatched heroes were bound to arrive today and begging the crowd to grant him until tomorrow at the very least. The crowd reacted with frustration, asking if Boreas honestly expected them to endure another agonizing day of constant danger. Observing the confrontation, Masamune thought to himself how remarkably cruel the townspeople were being toward the desperate old man. Taking charge of the situation, Sierra called out loudly to the crowd, demanding their full attention. As Boreas looked up in confusion and asked who she was, Sierra introduced herself, explaining that she had traveled all the way from the capital specifically to exterminate the menacing basilisk. Overjoyed by her announcement, Boreas asked if she was truly an adventurer, thanking God for her arrival before turning to inform the crowd that the long-awaited help from the guild had finally arrived to save them. Boreas breathed a massive sigh of relief, declaring with overwhelming gratitude that everything would finally be fine now. Hearing the announcement, the agitated crowd began to disperse, grumbling under their breath that the old man should have simply informed them the capital adventurers were arriving today. They muttered among themselves that they never would have made such a noisy ruckus in the first place had they known help was already on the way. Overcome with emotion, Boreas reached out and held Sierra's hands in deep thanks. Amidst the dispersing crowd, one particular man stood silently, casting a sharp, intense stare directly at the group before turning his back and walking away alongside the rest of the townspeople. Masamune caught sight of the individual and quietly watched his retreating figure as he disappeared into the distance. Suddenly, young Nemu twitched her nose and remarked that something smelled very strange. Masamune looked down at her and asked what was wrong. Nemu sniffed the air again with great care, explaining that a faint, peculiar odor was unnaturally mixed into the breeze. Hearing her observation, Masamune glanced back toward the road ahead, his eyes shifting once more to the mysterious man walking away in the distance. The mysterious man muttered to himself in disbelief that the dispatched heroes had actually arrived. Approaching the owner, Sierra offered a polite apology for their late arrival, to which Boreas immediately asked when they would be able to officially exterminate the beast. Masamune spoke up, assuring him that they would have the matter completely wrapped up by the end of the day, as he was eager to finish the task and explore the town. Sierra voiced her full agreement with his ambitious timeline. However, Boreas paused and urged them to wait, expressing deep gratitude for Sierra's willingness to fight, but pointing out that a basilisk was an exceedingly dangerous A-rank monster. Drawing on his past experience as a former adventurer, Boreas respectfully advised that they conduct a thorough and cautious investigation of the area before taking any direct action. Masamune was taken aback by his unexpected warning, though both he and Sierra quickly assured the old ranch owner that they would be completely fine. Sierra added with absolute confidence that there was nothing to fear since Masamune was accompanied by them. Masamune quietly thought to himself that while he had indeed suggested finishing the task today, Sierra seemed entirely intent on relying on his battle capabilities to solve the problem, despite the official request having been personally addressed to her. Sierra then stated that they should proceed to inspect Boreas's barn, asking if the target was located in the structure situated directly behind the main house. Boreas confirmed that it was, prompting Sierra to signal Masamune and hand him the key to the heavy wooden doors. As Masamune walked up to the entrance, young Nemu sniffed the air once again with great intensity. She declared with absolute certainty that it was not her imagination, as she could smell the exact same foul odor wafting out from inside the barn. Masamune turned to her and asked if the scent she detected was the distinct odor of a basilisk. Nemu affirmed that it was, adding that she had also caught the exact same stench coming off the heavy-set man dressed in luxurious clothes who had walked away from the crowd earlier. Boreas overheard her description and asked if she was referring to a wealthy man who sported a prominent mustache right under his nose. Nemu confirmed his suspicion, prompting Masamune to ask Boreas if he recognized the man's identity. Boreas revealed that the individual was almost certainly August, a regular traveling merchant who had been staying within the town for a considerable length of time. Boreas went on to explain that when he was preparing to submit his official request to the distant capital the other day, August had approached him directly and claimed that he possessed the means to drive the dangerous basilisk away himself, demanding the ownership of Boreas's land as compensation for his services. Masamune found it deeply suspicious that a simple merchant would offer to personally exterminate a high-ranking monster, and Boreas admitted that he had harbored the exact same doubts, leading him to flatly reject the offer. Boreas added that the ranch land was a cherished symbol of WIC that had been carefully passed down through his family for generations. Hearing this, Masamune deduced that the entire creature attack was likely an artificial crisis engineered by August. Boreas expressed complete shock at the implication, but Sierra agreed that the theory was highly probable. She pointed out that basilisks normally resided deep within isolated forests, making it absurdly suspicious for one to suddenly establish a nest on a domestic farm unless it had been deliberately placed there to force Boreas into giving up his valuable land. Boreas struggled to comprehend why anyone would go to such villainous lengths. Masamune praised Nemu for her exceptional sense of smell, noting that without her sharp perception, they never would have uncovered the hidden connection to August. Nemu beamed with a bright, proud smile at his warm compliment. Masamune then suggested that if possible, they should simply drive the basilisk away without taking its life, proposing that they render the monster unconscious and safely transport it back into the wild forest. Sierra agreed that it was a fine plan, and the party prepared to check the interior of the building. Masamune stepped up and unlocked the massive gate, quietly peeking through the narrow gap into the pitch-black darkness inside. To his horror, he found himself staring directly into the glowing eyes of a giant basilisk. Slipping back outside, Masamune quickly shut the door and stammered in disbelief, informing his companions that there were actually 3 giant basilisks resting inside the building. Sierra and the others gasped in shock, with Sierra pointing out that the official guild request had explicitly listed only a single basilisk. Boreas was equally bewildered, insisting that he had only seen one creature when he inspected the barn the previous day. Sierra noted that it was utterly impossible for the monster population to triple in a single day. Boreas explained the extreme danger involved, noting that even a single drop of basilisk venom was instantly lethal to human beings. He added that no sane adventurer would ever accept a contract to fight 3 basilisks at once unless the financial reward was massive, though under guild regulations, the overall rank of the request would remain unchanged while the payout would only increase by a trivial amount. Masamune finally understood why Sierra had been so visibly annoyed about taking the job earlier, realizing that fighting 3 such beasts was far too risky for a standard contract. Overcome with guilt, Boreas bowed his head and offered a sincere apology to the party. He confessed that there had actually been 3 monsters present from the very start, but when August aggressively demanded to see the official contract details, Boreas had felt compelled to lie about the true numbers. He admitted that had the local townspeople discovered 3 basilisks were nesting on his land, they would have taken extreme measures against him, and he knew no adventurer would willingly come to his aid if they knew the full truth. Yet, unable to simply sit by and watch his family's legacy be destroyed, he had felt forced to hide the details. Masamune paused for a moment to digest the revelation, then turned to Sierra and asked whether the monsters would die if he simply severed their heads. Sierra confirmed that cutting off their heads would indeed kill them instantly. Masamune declared that they would abandon their original peaceful plan and eliminate all 3 beasts immediately, noting that Sharon required their biological materials anyway. He instructed the rest of the group to step back to a safe distance, declaring that he would handle the entire battle by himself. Nemu cried out in worry, reminding him that the task was far too dangerous for a healer to undertake alone. Masamune gently reassured the young child, telling her not to worry because the fight would be over in a mere instant. Reassured by his calm confidence, Nemu stepped back to safety, where Toa held her close as Masamune prepared to enter the barn. Masamune paused for a brief moment, considering his strategy. He realized that if he wanted to harvest the necessary materials intact for Sharon, he He could not simply rely on his corrosion magic, as the destructive spell would leave absolutely nothing behind. He concluded that he would have to rely strictly on his blade to slay the beasts. Taking a deep breath, Masamune reached forward and pulled the heavy barn doors wide open. Inside, the three massive basilisks immediately stirred from their slumber, their sharp, glowing eyes locking onto the solitary intruder standing at the threshold. As the giant serpents coiled to strike, Masamune remained entirely calm, quickly sifting through his mind for a specialized sword technique capable of felling all three formidable foes in a single breath. Behind him, Sierra, Toa, Nemu, and Boreas watched with bated breath. Masamune took a firm step forward, deciding on the perfect technique for the task. In a flash of motion, he swung his sword with incredible precision, combining his raw martial prowess with his swift support magic, Godspeed. Executing the formidable Beast King style, he unleashed the devastating strike known as the Beast King Void Blade. The sheer speed and force of the attack left everyone in complete astonishment. Nemu gasped in sheer awe, remarking that the battle had truly ended in a mere instant, just as her master had promised. Walking calmly back out of the barn, Masamune turned to Sierra and suggested that they begin harvesting the necessary monster parts, double-checking if Sharon specifically requested the tear glands, poison sacs, and large fangs. Sierra nodded in agreement, admitting that she would feel guilty if she sat by and did no work at all after he had handled the entire fight alone. As they prepared to collect the materials, Toa called out to Masamune, voicing her suspicion that the three basilisks might have actually been completely harmless. When Masamune asked her what she meant, Toa explained that judging by their unnatural behavior and condition, the monsters appeared to have been deliberately bred and domesticated. Before they could discuss the matter further, a sharp, angry voice shouted at them from across the field. August strode toward them in a fury, demanding to know what they had done, swearing under his breath as he realized that the dead beasts belonged to a man named Gordon. Hearing his outburst, Boreas confronted August, asking if he was indeed the villain mastermind behind the entire scheme. Walking beside August was a towering, menacing man who called out to ask which of the group was Boreas. The intimidating stranger boasted that he was going to grandiosely sever Boreas's head using his massive guillotine sword. However, as the man looked past the owner and peered into the barn, his face twisted in disbelief. Demanding to know what had happened, he roared in anger upon realizing that his beloved pet monsters were all dead. August pointed directly at Masamune's group, declaring that it was the work of the adventurers Boreas had hired from the capital. The party turned their eyes toward the armed newcomer, who glared back intensely. The man pondered for a moment, attempting to deduce who possessed the strength to slay his beasts. He singled out Toa, but then shifted his gaze towards Sierra, noting that she possessed an exceptionally high level of magic power. Dismissing the mystery, he declared that it did not matter who did it, as he was simply going to slaughter the three men on the spot. As for the two women, he viciously proclaimed that he would sever all of their limbs and drag them back to his inn, using them to avenge his fallen pets. August turned to Boreas with a smug sneer, telling the old ranch owner that he had only himself to blame for failing to accept his original offer. When Boreas asked why August was so insanely fixated on acquiring this specific piece of property, August plainly explained that he intended to build a grand mansion on the land, where he could spend the rest of his life relaxing while gazing out at the prestigious view of WC, a lifestyle he considered the ultimate dream for a successful merchant. Boreas looked at him with deep sadness, remarking on how pitiful his values were. Unbothered by the judgment, August told him to say whatever he pleased, noting that he would have gladly paid Boreas a fair price had he given up the ranch peacefully. He added that Boreas would not have had to die today if he hadn't foolishly brought in adventurers to meddle in his affairs, declaring that this was the absolute end and that Boreas was going to die right here. The armed killer beside August interrupted, addressing the merchant and noting that two of the women in the party appeared to be remarkably strong combatants. He warned August that he had better provide a proper, hefty reward for taking on such dangerous opponents, sternly cautioning him not to deceive him. August assured him that he would never break his word, promising to double the agreed-upon payment if he successfully eliminated the group, though he noted with a smirk that he wouldn't pay a single coin if the mercenary failed. Offended by the implication, the man asked who August thought he was dealing with, declaring his name as Gordon. Turning to the group, Gordon asked who wished to be slaughtered first, generously offering to let them choose the order of their own deaths. Masamune watched the confrontation in total confusion, particularly bewildered when Toa suddenly stepped forward to face the mercenary. Gordon taunted her, asking if she was truly confident enough to challenge him all by herself, adding that the woman standing behind her was welcome to join the fight as well. Hearing the challenge, Sierra immediately took a firm step forward, accepting the duel on behalf of them both. Perplexed by their sudden eagerness to fight, Masamune asked what had gotten into both of them, only for Sierra and Toa to simultaneously order him to step back and let them handle the battle. Left completely speechless by their aggressive stance, Masamune stood watching in silence, while Gordon grumbled in annoyance, declaring that he thoroughly disliked their arrogant attitude.